steel, firearms, and the industrialists crossing into another world. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 226 Printing Plant 2. The workshop owner approached with a smile. Factory manager, ladies, is there anything I can do for you? Just show them around the workshop and explain the printing process. Yes, the factory manager nodded, then told Eileen and Laddie, he's the supervisor of this workshop. Ask him if you have any questions. I have work to do, so I'll take my leave now, and turned to leave. Eileen pouted at the manager's departing figure, while Laddie grabbed her hand and turned to the workshop manager, saying, then we'll trouble you, manager. Betty and I are quite interested in this place. The manager smiled awkwardly, not at all, please follow me. The three arrived at the nearest printing press, and the manager pointed to the machine, explaining its structure and working principle to Eileen and Laddie in detail. A worker was operating the machine, and the two women watched the entire printing process. Printing workers work in pairs, taking turns operating the printing plate and pulling the printing press. This job is quite physically demanding, while applying ink evenly to the paper requires a higher level of skill. One worker uses a spatula to apply ink to the printing plate, carefully wiping it with an ink roller. Then, they take an ink ball pad from the stand, lightly pat it onto the ink, and rub it in an arc motion on the plate to ensure the ink is evenly distributed. Next, they apply ink to each page of the printing plate in turn, occasionally wiping the ink ball pad to adjust the ink distribution. Simultaneously, the other worker places a sheet of paper in the printing position fixed to the paper holder, closes the upper paper clamp, and then uses their right hand to lower the paper holder, paper, and paper clamp to the plane of the inking type. With their right hand, they firmly grip the printing press handle, rotate it to move the front half of the printing plate under the pressure plate, pull down the printing press handle to move the rear half of the printing plate under the pressure plate, pull again, and then release the handle to allow it to spring back. Finally, they lift the pressure plate, move the printing plate out, and remove the paper holder device. Wow! So easy. This printing press is so useful. Eileen clapped her hands excitedly, her silvery voice drawing everyone's attention once more. Of course, they didn't agree with her words. Easy? This little girl makes it sound so simple. Try printing 200 single pages an hour yourself. You'll be crying. The workshop foreman smiled and explained, after setting up a plate, we'll print the planned quantity of paper on one side, then print the other side, hang them up to dry, and finally bind them and store them in the warehouse. Used printing plates need to be cleaned with alkaline solution and given to the typesetters to disassemble them into movable type. This is movable type. Lattice walked over to the typesetter Sam, looking at the metal movable type on the table. These little things were smaller than her little fingernail. Yes, Consultant Celia, this is movable type. Don't underestimate them because they're small, they're really not easy to make. The workshop foreman introduced it with a boastful tone. First, the letter engraver draws the letters on the end of the metal blank, then carves or files away the unwanted metal. These positive molds are then hardened and pressed into brass or bronze to create a blank negative mold, the width of which varies depending on the size of the letter. Next, all the raised metal parts on the printing surface are filed away, and the size of the negative mold is adjusted so that the type can be accurately embedded in the appropriate position at the bottom of the printing mold. Then the negative mold is handed to the foundry workers, who must ensure that the molten metal covers every corner of the type when casting it. This tests their skills, the two women exclaimed. So complicated. Then, how many sheets of paper can you print a day? The workshop foreman roughly estimated and replied, with a standard-sized printing plate, 2 skilled printers can print 250 to 300 single pages per hour. If the printing plate is larger, then even ink application becomes more difficult, and the speed will decrease. Our workshop can print 3,000 pages a day, double-sided. The director patted his chest proudly and said, no other workshop is as fast as ours, and their quality isn't as good either. Eileen's mouth gaped open in astonishment as she said, this speed is indeed much faster than copying books. Laddie picked up a newly bound book next to her and was pleasantly surprised to find that it was actually a collection of poems from her hometown. Zhao. They actually print books like this here. Oh, you mean that one? It's a batch of books from Zhao that the Lord sent for us to print, but we don't understand the Zhao language on them. Casting the movable type and typesetting them was a huge undertaking. I heard the Lord is going to sell them back to Zhao. I heard the factory manager say it's something called Extreme Witness written by some poet from Zhao. If you ask me, those Zhao people are just bored and have nothing better to do than write such pointless whining. Laddie was speechless. The workshop manager, unaware that the female consultant in front of him was from Zhao, continued to ramble on about her opinions. Well, selling them back to rip off those rich guys is a great business deal. I heard everyone there is rolling in money. Ouch, the manager jumped up, clutching his foot. Eileen said apologetically, "Oh dear, I'm so sorry, I wasn't paying attention when I was taking a step." The director, looking at her delicate face, couldn't bring himself to be angry. He waved his hand and said, "Haha, it's alright, it's alright." Eileen and Laddie toured the factory for half a day, finally leaving behind the samples to be printed and departing around noon. They chatted as they walked, exchanging their opinions on what they had seen. "Betty, I think this printing press is far more remarkable than those muskets and cannons." "I think so too. If we make more printing presses, books will become so cheap that even ordinary people can afford them." Weren't the literacy books and basic hygiene manuals we just sent for ordinary people? Although the content is very simple, they are the keys to unlocking the door to knowledge. Haha, you, the head of the education department, can really show off your skills. Yes, seeing the printing press has indeed given me more and more confidence. Speaking of the education department, if you had been there, that idiot would probably have appointed you as the head. Don't say that. It's perfectly fitting for you to take on this position. Let those men see what we women can do. Eileen clenched her small fist. "I will definitely work hard." She suddenly relaxed it, as if she had thought of something, and said somewhat absent-mindedly, "However, won't the identity of scholar become less and less valuable?" Laddie's face darkened for a moment, then she smiled brightly. "Isn't it what we all want to see, more people gain knowledge?" "That's right." Seeing how open-minded the other person was, Eileen felt relieved. Chapter 227. As February arrived, although the weather remained cold, the signs of spring were gradually emerging. Everything began to revive, and vibrant green appeared on the northwestern plains. On the road from Arda to the neighboring territory of Larnaca, a troop of horses galloped along. "To be honest, I prefer the snow-covered winter to the warm, green spring," Paul complained to Melon beside him. "It's just a pity that such a beautiful season passes too quickly." "You're not joking, Paul," Melon was surprised. Winters in the northwest were a major hardship for the inhabitants, with many poor people freezing to death every year. The longer the winter, the more civilians will freeze to death. "I can't believe you, a lord, would say such a thing." I apologize, my words were indeed inappropriate. "I assure you, winter will shed its harshness and become a warm and beautiful season." With the commencement of blast furnace iron making, Paul planned to increase coal production for coke manufacturing. However, the mined coal would not only be used for iron smelting but would also be sold to the common people at a low price. "Tell me why Earl Price Parker invited us. What are your thoughts?" "He just wants our technology, right? Didn't we agree to discuss it further when we got back? His Excellency's birthday celebration. I think there might be something else." The group arrived at the Parker family's castle in the evening. Earl Price Parker ushered Paul and Melon inside. After some pleasantries, the Earl arranged for them to have some food and drink, and after a short rest, he sent someone to invite them to dinner. "Lord Parker, what brings you to your castle?" Paul and Melon only heard that they had important matters to discuss, without specifying what they were. Ahem. "Paul, Melon, I'm your elder, so I'll take the liberty of calling you by your names. I've invited you here regarding the Duke's heir. As you know, Duke Ferdinand has designated Earl Kent as his successor. What are your thoughts on this?" "Thoughts?" Paul and Melon exchanged a glance, unable to decipher the Earl's meaning. Just as Paul was considering how to reply, Melon spoke up first. He said indignantly, "I'm personally pessimistic. That Malfs Kent is no good man. He has none of the demeanor of a high-ranking noble. Last year, he even tried to extort us and almost launched an attack. Although we didn't actually do it later, I don't know why, we've already made enemies. Lord Parker must know that he was arrogant and domineering before, relying on the Duke's favor, making the lords of the Northwest dare not speak out. Once he becomes Duke, he'll definitely be even more outrageous." Paul broke out in a cold sweat. wanting to stop him, but it was too late. "Oh dear, my good brother, you've been too quick with your tongue. What if this Price Parker is in cahoots with Maltz Kent? What if he's testing us at the Earl of Kent's behest? Are there 500 axemen lying in ambush outside? Just waiting for Earl Parker to smash his cup?" He looked at the old Earl with slight nervousness. Price's expression remained unchanged. He didn't smash the cup, but simply kept stroking his gray beard. After Paul waited anxiously for nearly a minute, Price finally spoke. "Myron's words resonate with me greatly. I also feel that Maltz Kent becoming Duke is not a good thing for us," the old Earl said solemnly, "especially for us, the direct vassals of the royal family." "What do you mean, Lord Parker? Let me introduce you to someone. Viscount, please come in." Price clapped his hands vigorously as he spoke. A figure emerged from around the corner of the corridor and walked towards them. Paul and Myron were taken aback. The newcomer was none other than Viscount Henry Ferdinand, the younger brother of Duke Ferdinand. Wasn't he imprisoned in the dungeon by his own brother? How could he be here? Had the brothers reconciled? Paul looked at Price with a head full of questions. Price said to Henry, "Viscount, these two are indeed not on Maltz Kent's side. You must have heard about the near war between Arda and Emden last year. Tell them what happened." Henry Ferdinand looked much thinner than at the Duke's birthday banquet, but his face showed more resolve. He bowed to Paul and Myron, then hurriedly said, "Your Excellencies, Maltz Kent is plotting to betray the kingdom, treason the kingdom." Paul and Myron were both taken aback. "Wow, that's a lot of information. You mean, he's planning a rebellion like Giles?" "Yes, that must be his plan." "How did you find out, Viscount? Shouldn't you have informed your brother first, so he can strip Maltz Kent of his heirship and arrest him?" Paul was somewhat incredulous. Although the Kent family was powerful in the northwest, they were at most earls. They had no chance against the kingdom's government. "Oh, perhaps he'll have some leverage now that he's inherited the dukedom, but what if Duke Ferdinand finds out about his plot? Wait, could it be Duke Ferdinand who's planning the rebellion? Isn't Maltz Kent his most trusted henchman?" Paul looked at Viscount Henry. If that were the case, was this guy going to betray his own brother? A look of sorrow crossed Viscount Henry's face. "My brother told me about this, and my brother, the dignified Duke of the Northwest, has already been controlled by that scoundrel Maltz Kent." Paul and Mellon roughly understood what was going on. Duke Ferdinand had been controlled by Maltz in some way, and Maltz had discovered his rebellious ambitions, secretly informing his younger brother, Viscount Henry, who then went out and exposed Maltz to the other lords. Of course, this is based on the premise that Viscount Henry wasn't lying. Many questions remain unanswered, such as what methods could have made a duke so obedient, even at a birthday banquet in front of so many lords. He dared not speak out and could only secretly inform his younger brother. And how did Viscount Henry escape? Seemingly anticipating Paul and the others' questions, Henry took out a piece of paper and handed it to them. "This is a letter from my brother. Please take a look." Chapter 228 Torture. The barbed whip lashed mercilessly across the victim's back. His clothes were tattered, revealing raw, bloody flesh beneath. The cotton wadding of his garments was indistinguishable from the exposed skin, the gushing blood staining his entire back a horribly red. Despite this, the executioner did not stop, as if the kneeling man harbored some deep-seated grudge against him. Useless. Useless. Is this how you repay the Kent family's kindness? Maltz Kent's son, Jace Kent, was whipping an officer mercilessly, hurling insults and venting his rage. The kneeling officer only groaned in pain when he could no longer bear it, but never uttered a word of pleading, knowing that would only bring more terrible consequences. Can't even keep an eye on one person? What's wrong with your eyes? What's wrong with your brain? Jace Kent continued his tirade, his whip cracking with undiminished force. All right, if you keep hitting him, he'll really die, a deep voice came from behind. Jace stopped and turned around, only to find Earl Kent standing behind him. His father was becoming increasingly elusive. His military experience had made Jace extremely sensitive to people suddenly appearing behind him. He considered himself highly vigilant, but he hadn't noticed a sound just now. When had his father arrived, and how had he gotten behind him? "Father, I'm disciplining this good-for-nothing. HMPH, when I was leading troops in the south, this kind of good-for-nothing was already enough." Earl Kent raised his hand to interrupt his son. He turned his gaze to the dying officer. As soon as Jace stopped, the officer could no longer hold on and collapsed to the ground. "I ask you, are you truly unaware of Henry Ferdinand's escape?" The officer gasped for breath, forcing himself to sit up, his legs still on the ground. "My lord. Lord Kent, I truly didn't know," he answered weakly. "I checked the dungeon before going to bed, nothing seemed amiss." Viscount Henry was already asleep. Then, the next day he was gone, and the guard said, "All right." Earl Kent waved his hand. This was the same story the other man had already told during the interrogation. He didn't want to hear it again. Henry Ferdinand had escaped, vanished without a trace, and none of the guards that day had noticed anything unusual. The lock on Henry's cell had been changed by the warden, who had the only key with him. There were no signs of forced entry. The only possibility seemed to be that the warden had let Henry escape. But the warden before him, beaten bloody and mangled, was someone he had planted. He knew this man's past perfectly well. The chances of him being connected to Henry were extremely slim. Earl Kent suddenly had a terrifying thought. Could Henry Ferdinand have escaped using some mysterious power? Or was Henry himself a sorcerer? Ever since his encounter with Barnett and learning of magic and the existence of the Arcane Society, Moltke had attributed any inexplicable event to mysterious forces. Earl Kent turned and asked, "Young Andy, do you think this person is telling the truth or lying?" Jace then noticed a little boy named Andy following behind his father. Like Barnett, Andy was also from that mysterious organization, and his father had already told him many things. The young mage standing behind Moltke was trembling slightly, terrified by Jace's methods of execution. Hearing the Earl's question, Andy hurriedly looked up, somewhat nervously saying, "I'm not very familiar with lie detection, but I don't think he's lying. I understand." Earl Kent turned to his son. "Jace, you handle these people as you see fit?" A sharp glint flashed in the Earl's son's eyes. "Yes, father, these people." Andy looked around in confusion, but the sight made him feel nauseous. In the adjacent cell, a group of people lay sprawled on the floor, no longer recognizable as human. Some, like the officers who had just been tortured, were covered in blood and gore, others had their limbs twisted into grotesque shapes, and still others were missing their hands and feet altogether. These were the dungeon guards. Despite their brutal torture, they made no sound of groaning. Perhaps they had no strength left, or perhaps their minds and senses of pain had become numb. Only the slight rise and fall of their chests indicated that their bodies were not yet dead. Ugh, the little mage couldn't hold back any longer and vomited. Seeing his reaction, Earl Kent frowned. Honestly, the Arcane Society, or Master Barnett, had sent such a goody two-shoes to assist him. After spending these days together, he had come to understand the little mage's personality. Apart from his knowledge of mysterious magic, he was completely just an ordinary child. At first, he thought the boy was deliberately acting like a child to disguise his identity. How could a mage be so naive? Later, he realized he had misjudged him. Earl Kent felt a growing sense of unease, as if he were being underestimated. Did the Mystic Order not value him more than Northwest Bay at all? Sending such a small child, was they treating him like a babysitter? His only consolation was that Andy was relatively well-behaved and obedient. If it had been a truly unruly and willful child, he wouldn't know what to do. After all, the other was a mage, a member of the Mystic Order. "Young friend Andy, your mental fortitude is too weak. We are people who are about to accomplish great things. We can't be intimidated by this kind of scene." He patted the young mage on the shoulder. "But why treat them like this? It's just an escaped prisoner. And they weren't negligent. The prisoner escaped in a way we didn't even know about." Andy looked at Earl Kent, fear evident in his eyes. This man was terrifying. How could a normal person do such a cruel thing? Was it right or wrong for him to assist him? No, the Earl's feigned kindness vanished abruptly, startling Andy. The Count said fiercely, "I only care about results. They're responsible for guarding the dungeon, so they must ensure the prisoners don't escape. But now the prisoners have escaped, and any explanation, any reason, is meaningless. They must be punished. This situation proves they're useless in their positions, and useless people only continue to waste food." The Count finished speaking and walked outside. HMPH, accompanied by Jace's soft chuckle, a gust of cold wind blew, making the little mage shiver. Chapter 229. The deepest room in the dungeon is one of the entrances to a secret underground passage leading directly outside Scent City. It was dug by the Ferdinand family as a precaution, and that's how I escaped, Viscount Henry recounted in detail in Earl Parker's castle. Paul carefully examined a piece of paper covered in tiny handwriting. According to Viscount Henry, it was a letter from his brother. The handwriting was somewhat messy, as if written in haste. Underground passages weren't unusual. Having an extra escape route was instinctive for every lord. The castle in Lakeshire also had a secret tunnel. The letter, however, described a terrible situation. Earl Maltskant had seized control of Duke Ferdinand, the writer himself, and was forcing the Duke to publicly pass the title to him. Maltskant was plotting to betray the Kingdom of Alder and establish himself in the northwest while the main royal army marched south to fight the Giles rebels. As for how the Duke was controlled, the words in the letter made Paul's eyelids twitch. Disgusting worms, magic, witchcraft. The Duke used a series of words that sounded like rambling to outsiders, but Paul, who had been in close contact with the wizards, knew that it might be true. Henry, I have now regained some control of my mind and struggle to write this letter. I'm done for. His evil witchcraft has drained my energy. I hope that after you see this, you will avenge me and save the Ferdinand family. Now, that traitor Maltz has secretly monitored every member of our family. I will find a way to help you get rid of his surveillance. The letter ended like this, and Paul fell into deep thought, thinking of the mysterious sorcerer organization, the Arcane Society, that he knew about before. Could they be related to Maltskant's conspiracy? Although it's a bit messy, I can confirm that this letter was indeed written by His Excellency the Duke himself. I recognize his handwriting. Seeing Paul deep in thought, Earl Parker thought he was doubting the authenticity of the letter. I swear on my own honor and the honor of my family that this letter is genuine, and everything I have said is true. Henry immediately swore. Paul looked up and asked, "What are your plans, both of you? What can we do?" Of course, we should immediately raise an army to punish that bastard. Viscount Henry was about to speak when Earl Parker stopped him. This matter requires careful consideration. We cannot act rashly for now. The Kent family is powerful, and the current Duke is controlled by them. Of course, a direct confrontation is inevitable. That Maltskant fellow is not someone we can simply join forces with and issue a proclamation to obediently submit to. Although he had some doubts about the witchcraft mentioned in the letter, there was no doubt that Duke Ferdinand had to obey the Kent family. He had suspected it when the Duke designated Kent as his heir at his birthday banquet. Under normal circumstances, the title would not fall into the hands of the Kent family. Even if the main family members were incompetent, there were certainly collateral families closer to the Kent family. Price Parker was determined to go against the Maltskant family, as his family had a long-standing, albeit covert, conflict with him. Paul hesitated. "Oh, I think, Earl Gleman." Earl Parker's face hardened with seriousness. "You don't actually have any hope for that Kent fellow, do you? Have you forgotten the conflict between your two families last year? I don't need to guess to know that Guy must have made many unreasonable demands of you, and not just you, but many lords in the Northwest Bay suffered as a result. Last year, tensions between the Gleman and Kent families were extremely high, almost escalating into a war. Although neither family publicly announced the reason, the lords had a pretty good idea. Arda had made a lot of money, and Earl Kent was envious. That's just the kind of person he is." Earl Parker continued, HMPH. "Once he becomes a duke, will we have a good time? Even worse, he's planning a rebellion. We're all subjects of His Majesty the King. Are we just going to let him run rampant? To be honest, we've already spoken with several lords, and they all deeply hate that traitor Maltskant. We're prepared to unite against him." The old earl stared intently at Paul and asked, "Earl Gleman, Earl Garnard, what are your thoughts?" Damn it, Paul thought to himself, it seemed he had to choose sides. These two groups were right next to his territory, there was no way he could remain neutral. "What are your plans?" he whispered to Mellon, who sat beside him. "Of course, it's to deal with the Maltskant with Count Parker and the others. Have you forgotten how the Kent family extorted us last year?" "Yes, that's what I thought too, but..." Paul turned to Price Parker and asked loudly, "Lord Parker, how many lords have you gathered?" Count Parker smiled slightly. He saw the doubt in Paul's heart. "Paul, our strength is definitely considerable. But I understand your concerns. How about this? In a few days I will invite everyone to discuss important matters. You can go back first and come back then. Of course, you can also stay here for a few days until everyone arrives." Count Parker seemed quite confident. "Then let's come back in a few days. Myron and I also hate Maltskant. If you can really gather a powerful force, I will definitely participate." "All right, it's settled then. I will inform you when the time comes." After the business was discussed, everyone began to enjoy dinner. After finishing, Paul and Myron took their leave and returned to their rooms to rest. Viscount Henry stayed behind and cautiously asked Earl Parker, My lord, how much help will these two be to us? I've heard that the Gleman family has always been weak, and the Garnered family just experienced a rebellion last year involving almost all of their vassals. How? Duke Parker chuckled, stroking his beard. Henry, you can't look at things with old eyes. Leaving aside Barden, Arda is a completely different place now. The pirates of the Northwest Bay were wiped out by the Gleman family, albeit while their leader Edward was missing and the pirates were leaderless. That's not something an earldom could easily accomplish. Moreover, the Gleman family helped quell Barden's rebellion. And those traitors had quite a few knights under their command. I believe that having them participate in our plans will be of great benefit. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 230 Alliance. After Paul and Myron returned to their territory, they described their experiences in Larnaca to the high-ranking officials of the council and the army. The Parker family was secretly forming an alliance against Earl Kent? Everyone was astonished by this news. So, what do you think we should do? Join this secret alliance? Inform Earl Kent? Or remain neutral? We still have the chance to choose before the fighting starts, Paul asked. He wouldn't impulsively side with a secret alliance just because of a grudge against the Kent family. What if they chose the wrong side and lost? The sound of fists slamming on the table rang out. Of course, join this alliance and give those Kent bastards a good beating. Have you forgotten how they treated us last year? I still get angry just thinking about it. It was Bryce who spoke, repeatedly pounding his fist on the table as he expressed his opinion. Before, we were outnumbered and outmatched by the Kent family, and we had to pretend nothing had happened to deal with their rudeness. But now that so many lords are against him, why not seize this opportunity to retaliate against the humiliation they have inflicted on us? Bryce, watch your manners in front of the Earl. Schroeder reached out to stop the 1st Battalion commander's impulsive words. Martz Kent is now the heir to the Duke's throne. If that letter is genuine, then the Duke is already under his control. He can use the Duke of Ferdinand to command the other vassals of the Ferdinand family. We're not just facing the Kent family, Bryce protested. Once that letter is made public, who'll support him? Schroeder shook his head. It's just a letter. It's not very convincing. Even I doubt its authenticity. It's very likely that Earl Parker had long wanted to overthrow the Kent family, and Viscount Henry was dissatisfied because he wasn't the heir to the Duke's throne. So the two of them conspired to forge this letter. The reason it was written so hastily was to avoid giving themselves away with a poorly imitated writing. That's also a possibility. Bryce was speechless. Which side do you two earls want to stand on? Steward Ford asked, stroking his beard. He had been resting with his eyes closed, listening to the discussion. Myron and I are both inclined to join the alliance against the Kent family, if Earl Parker's forces are substantial enough. Steward Ford nodded. Morally speaking, the Kent family has always acted with impunity in the Northwest Bay, and everyone has suffered under their oppression. Eliminating or weakening the Kent family would certainly be welcomed by everyone. Moreover, there are the two things, the kidnapping of the Duke and the plot to betray the kingdom. Whether they are true or not doesn't matter. When everyone needs them to be true, they are 200% true. Either one is a grave crime, and, Steward Ford paused, then slowly said, according to the letter, Earl Kent is also suspected of practicing witchcraft. Paul noticed that Laddie, the female advisor responsible for writing the meeting minutes, trembled slightly. Steward Ford continued, from a practical standpoint, the Kent family is a threat to us. They are powerful, exert significant military pressure on us, and they did indeed threaten us last year, almost launching an attack. Not only that, among the surrounding territories, the Kent family levies the highest taxes on our goods, practically robbing us. And they control several important transportation hubs. Therefore, I suggest you seize this opportunity. Steward Ford's words made Paul even more inclined to join the alliance against the Kent family. The others also agreed with Steward Ford. Hansel, in particular, was highly sensitive to the Earl of Kent's suspected rebellion. The royal government was focusing its efforts on dealing with the rebels in the south, and he had just received news from the capital that the suppression army was about to march south. The emergence of another rebel force in the rear at this time would be extremely unfavorable. Now that we have set the general direction, we must begin preparations. Revise and activate the contingency plans we used last year to deal with the Kent family threat, strengthen our military, and shift our production focus to the military. The meeting made the above resolution. After Paul and his companions left, Earl Parker continued to contact nobles in various regions. The lords exchanged letters, sharing their views on the Kent family. Gradually, an anti-Kent faction began to form among the northwestern lords. A month after his last invitation to Paul and Myron, Earl Parker felt it was time. After extensive testing and screening, he identified some staunch faction members who, with his leadership, would undoubtedly join his alliance. It was time to gather everyone to discuss the specifics. Laketown received another invitation from a neighboring territory. Paul and Myron set off again, arriving at Earl Parker's castle on the appointed date. Upon entering the hall, Paul was taken aback. A considerable number of people had already gathered, all prominent lords of the Northwest Bay. A closer look revealed that the vast majority of the lords were direct vassals of the royal family or their dependents, while only a handful came from the line of Duke Ferdinand. Gentlemen, let's begin our serious discussion. Once everyone was present, Earl Parker announced the start of the meeting. The most important reason you've all gathered here today is to investigate Malfskent's kidnapping of Duke Ferdinand and his plot to betray the kingdom. As His Majesty's subjects, we absolutely cannot stand idly by. We must extinguish this fire before he rises up. With a rebellion in the south still unresolved, this is the time for us to be loyal to His Majesty and ensure the stability of the kingdom's rear. A chorus of responses rang out in the hall, and a few scattered individuals stepped forward to pledge their loyalty to the royal family. Earl Parker continued loudly, "Of course, there's another secondary reason, to unite against the oppression of the Kent family. Everyone knows of Malfskent's notorious misdeeds, most of us have even suffered at his hands. If he was this bad as an earl, he'll only become worse if he becomes a duke." Paul thought to himself, that's probably the main reason everyone's here. Sure enough, as soon as the old earl finished speaking, the hall erupted in a commotion. One by one, lords who had grudges against the Kent family stood up to denounce Malfskent's misdeeds, and the meeting began to resemble a grievance session. Chapter 231 Alliance 2. That old scoundrel Malx once stole a herd of my horses, claiming I spoke ill of him behind his back. Of course, that was all made up. I always spoke ill of him to his face. One of my border villages was forcibly seized by the Kent family. What? That was my ancestral land, passed down from when my ancestors were knights, and that little beast of the Kent family. He brazenly arrested people he'd offended in my territory without even a word. Those were my people. Even when beating a dog, you have to consider its owner. This brat has absolutely no respect for me, his lord. When my territory was invaded by pirates, he demanded my allegiance before offering aid. He's utterly ignorant and arrogant. Doesn't he know I'm a loyal subject of His Majesty the King? 3 years ago, Viscount Cole was framed by Maltz, falsely accused of secretly opposing Earl Ferdinand. As a result, his entire family was exiled, and his property was seized by the Kent family. I still remember this vividly. It sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. He also built a dam on his own lands, charging water fees every dry season. We lords downstream are extorted by him every year. Malfskent, a villain. A villain. The hall was filled with clamor as the lords denounced the Kent family's crimes, expressing their dissatisfaction with this arrogant family. The more they talked, the more fervent they became, portraying the Kent family as utterly wicked scoundrels. Earl Parker, seeing that the situation was ripe, stood up and waved his hands. "Gentlemen, quiet. Quiet." With his words, the hall gradually fell silent, and everyone looked at Price Parker. The old earl declared loudly, "Simply talking here won't do any real harm to the Kent family. Only concrete actions can bring them down." Immediately, someone shouted, "Your Excellency, please tell us what to do." With the leader, the others echoed, expressing their determination to fight the Kent family to the end. The old earl immediately replied, "Cooperation. Only through our combined efforts can we confront the Kent family. The people in this hall represent only about half of the lords of the Northwest Bay, meaning that half of them still support, or at least don't oppose, Malfskent. He can now sideline the Duke and manipulate the Ferdinand family's power. We are still slightly inferior in strength, so we must unite." The old earl is right. Let's unite against the Kent family. Seeing that no one objected, Price Parker secretly breathed a sigh of relief. The lords attending this meeting were all carefully selected and invited by him, but he hadn't expected it to go so smoothly. HMPH, Maltz Kent, you're usually so arrogant and domineering, but I never imagined you'd make so many enemies behind the scenes. With the advantage in strength, Maltz will definitely not surrender willingly. We'll have to fight him sooner or later. Everyone, contribute what you can, whether it's money or manpower. Let's take stock of our forces now. I'll start. My pack family can provide 50 knights and 1,500 soldiers. Hearing the old count's words, the lords in the hall also announced the forces they could contribute. They had all anticipated this and had carefully calculated their options beforehand. My Malkin family can provide 50 knights and 1,200 soldiers. My Heller family can provide 30 knights and 1,300 soldiers. My Johnston family can provide 20 knights and 1,000 soldiers. When it was Paul and Myron's turn, Paul announced the number of troops his two families could provide. The Gleman and Garnard families can provide a total of 1,000 soldiers. Earl Parker stroked his beard and nodded. He knew that the Arda people were not numerous, and that Byron had suffered a rebellion last year, so it was understandable that they could only provide 1,000 men. After all the lords had announced their numbers, they could organize a large army of more than 500 knights and more than 12,000 soldiers. Paul thought to himself, half the lords in the northwest alone could muster over 10,000 soldiers. If all the lords in the country wholeheartedly support the royal family, the southern rebellion could probably be quelled in just 6 months. Paul subconsciously compared this to the soldiers trained in Arda, forgetting that most of the soldiers these lords spoke of were temporarily conscripted farmers. If the lords truly provided these peasant soldiers to the royal family, managing them would be an enormous problem. Suppressing the rebellion in the south was a long journey, unlike fighting on their own doorstep as with a Kent family. With the logistical capabilities of this era, feeding and caring for these people would be a disaster. Moreover, these soldiers couldn't stay on the battlefield for long, otherwise, who would farm? Count Parker was very satisfied with the alliance's strength. He stroked his beard with a broad smile and said, "Excellent. Our strength is fully capable of rivaling Maltz Kent and his cronies. Furthermore, we must report to His Majesty the King the Kent family's crimes of kidnapping their lord and plotting a rebellion, and to the church their alleged witchcraft. We must ensure the righteous cause is on our side and gain more support." The lords then agreed on detailed steps. Upon returning home, they began recruiting and training troops, guarding their respective territories. If the Kent family discovered something amiss and sent troops to attack, the other lords were to immediately go to their aid. Once the forces were nearly ready, the lords jointly wrote a letter to the entire nation, exposing the Kent family's misdeeds, focusing on reporting them to the royal family and the church. Besides kidnapping their lord, plotting a rebellion, and practicing witchcraft, they also included the various forms of oppression they had inflicted on the people. At the same time, an ultimatum was issued to the Kent family, demanding that Maltz Kent immediately confess. If he could demote himself by 1 rank, release Duke Ferdinand, return the benefits extorted from them, and pay a substantial fine, they would work together to protect him from the royal family and the church. After all, he was a nobleman and lord of the Northwest Bay, and a chance to reform should be given. Paul initially had some objections. In his opinion, people like Maltz Kent should be thoroughly defeated and punished severely. Mellon quietly advised him, "Everyone will be afraid of your suggestion. I don't know about other places, but in the Northwest Bay, leaving each other a way out is an unwritten rule among lords, unless there is a deep-seated hatred between them. Leave a way out for others, so you can meet again in the future." Yes, that's exactly what it means. There aren't many things that would make lords want to destroy each other, what are they? The hatred of patricide or a rebellion by the common people. Chapter 232. During this period, Maltz Kent's mood grew increasingly agitated. Logically, the situation was developing as planned, the only minor hiccup being the escape of Henry Ferdinand. But this should have been insignificant. As a prisoner personally ordered to be imprisoned by Duke Ferdinand, Henry's escape meant a life of exile. Henry's family had been arrested, and his lands and property confiscated. Only one thing remained: how had he escaped? This unresolved matter seemed to foreshadow an ominous future, becoming a thorn in Maltz Kent's side. And just as he feared, 2 weeks after Henry's escape, the Earl of Kent began to hear rumors. It seemed someone was secretly conspiring with lords across the land against him. The inherently suspicious Earl of Kent immediately dispatched spies to investigate, and the situation gradually became clear. A despicable and shameful conspiracy was brewing, and the instigator was none other than Earl Price Parker, with whom he harbored a secret grudge. "That old bastard is courting death," After reading the secret report, Earl Kent roared, kicking over the table in front of him. His servant, startled, knelt on the ground. The Earl paced anxiously around the room. He had initially intended to immediately summon the army and wipe out these sneaky villains, but after careful consideration, he abandoned the idea. First, he needed to determine who were enemies and who were allies. Maltz Kent, now the Duke's heir, remained and sent to handle various affairs for Duke Ferdinand. He immediately wrote a letter, having his men make many copies and send them to the lords in various regions, inviting them to send to discuss an important matter, whether to continue sending troops to assist the royal family in suppressing the rebellion. However, only slightly more than half of the lords attended the meeting in person. The others either made excuses or sent representatives. Among those who didn't attend was Earl Plath Parker, who had already been identified as the instigator of the conspiracy. Even that little scoundrel from the Gleman family, he shouldn't have been let off the hook last year. These absent lords must have something to hide. The lords who came to Sent City argued all day without reaching a conclusion, and the meeting ended in discord. Maltz Kent didn't care at all. The meeting itself wasn't his purpose. As he assessed the scope of the enemy, that was his real goal. As everyone dispersed, he warned, anyone who dares to challenge the Duke's authority will never have a good end. The lords thought sourly, won't he be yours sooner or later? After roughly narrowing down the enemy and allied forces, Maltz began to gather his confidants, contact potential allies, and build his own alliance. He was already the largest vassal of the Ferdinand family, and now, controlling the Duke and becoming his heir, he quickly amassed a large following. With the Kent family's strength, they could easily take on any family in the northwest alone, but facing an alliance of many lords required careful consideration. Therefore, he also needed to organize his own faction. Thus, the lords of the Northwest Bay gradually formed two camps, both preparing for war and waiting for the opportune moment to deliver a fatal blow to their enemy. A small-scale civil war was imminent. To Maltz Kent's shock, his enemies had revealed his secrets, using witchcraft to hold the Duke hostage, plotting to betray the kingdom like Giles, and so on. How did they know? Earl Kent was utterly bewildered. He had always been extremely secretive, and out of his reverence and faith in mysticism, he hadn't suspected the dying Duke Ferdinand. However, these matters had only come through rumors, and while his enemies hadn't yet made a big deal out of it, it had already made Earl Kent uneasy. On the surface, the Earl feigned indifference to the rumors and refused to defend himself, but privately he became increasingly suspicious, suspecting that spies had been planted among his men. Many of the Earl's servants and guards who had served him suffered greatly, some were imprisoned, others executed, and the Duke's mansion, where Maltz lived, was in a state of constant fear. After returning to Lake Town from Earl Parker's castle, Paul threw himself into preparations for the impending war. His territory bordered Maltz Kent's stronghold, Emden, making him a prime target in the event of war, so he had to prepare in advance. However, in the days that followed, he witnessed firsthand how the lords of this era waged war. Nearly a month had passed since the meeting organized by Price Parker ended, yet the war still hadn't broken out. During this time, rumors were flying everywhere. Some loose tongue had leaked several of Maltz Kent's major crimes, and news of the lords plotting to overthrow the Parker family had also spread. Naturally, this news reached Maltz Kent's ears, so he too began to organize his forces. Now, the whole world knew that two powerful factions in the Northwest Bay were locked in a fierce struggle to eliminate each other. The sense of secrecy these days is truly appalling. I was even thinking of launching a surprise attack once we were ready, Paul lamented at a staff meeting, reiterating the importance of secrecy. Both sides were dragging their feet on troop build-up. Paul considered using a standing army's advantage to launch a surprise attack and capture Emden in the south, but abandoned the idea due to objections from his officers. What if the enemy's forces were already stronger than theirs, and their allies couldn't provide sufficient support for Alda? It was best not to be the first to act. Thus, Lakeside Town took full advantage of the calm before the storm to strengthen its forces. Both the regular army and the militia intensified their training, and the soldiers were so exhausted they didn't even have the energy to visit brothels, collapsing into bed and falling fast asleep as soon as they returned to their barracks. Under the organization of the State Council, the population of the southernmost villages began migrating north to prevent raids by the Kent family. The shipyards in Flanders began working overtime to build merchant ships suitable for transport. In case the war went poorly and land trade routes were cut off, maritime trade would become the lifeline for Arda and Barden, both places currently heavily reliant on foreign trade. The ironworks in the valley were also being expanded again. With the outbreak of war, the surrounding lords' demand for iron would increase significantly, and Paul planned to use cheap iron to curry favor and strengthen his influence within the alliance. The sword was drawn, ready to pierce the enemy. Chapter 233 Salt Workers. Kevin, feeling dizzy and disoriented, stood guard at his stall. It was already noon, and he still hadn't eaten or drunk anything. His stomach rumbled incessantly, protesting to his brain. But what could he do? He'd been setting up his stall since sunrise, only to earn a meager few copper coins, far too few to buy food. He sat on the ground, hugging his legs with his arms, feeling utterly helpless. A tattered cloth lay on the ground in front of him. This was Kevin's stall, with several bags of gleaming white things on it. Salt, that was what Kevin was selling. Kevin's village had always relied on salt production for a living. Merchants used to come every month to buy salt and pay them. But gradually, things changed. The merchants started driving down prices, adopting a take-it-or-leave-it attitude. Their village relied almost entirely on salt production. They had no other livelihood and had no choice but to accept the merchants' price cutting. But the prices they offered became increasingly unbearable, and they came to buy salt less and less frequently. News had reached Franklin Port that a group of merchants, led by the wealthy salt merchant Godwin, had established a salt works near the port. They didn't know what methods they used, but it was rumored to produce tons of salt, far more efficiently than the boiling method used in their village. When the salt works first started operating, they couldn't meet all the demand, and the merchants still relied on the salt workers. However, as the salt works grew larger and their output increased, their dependence on the salt workers decreased. The salt produced from the salt works wasn't any better than the boiled salt from Kevin's village, and was even slightly inferior in quality. But it had one unparalleled advantage: it was cheap. It was incredibly cheap. Kevin had learned that a family with enough to eat could buy enough salt to make pickled fish. With the income from boiling salt decreasing, the family quickly became unable to make ends meet, and their already meager savings would soon be depleted. Out of desperation, Kevin and his fellow villagers began selling their salt in nearby towns. To avoid competition, they each chose a destination. Kevin's chosen destination was Franklin Port. He arrived in Flanders yesterday, but after a day of setting up his stall, he had only earned a pittance of copper coins. Hungry until evening, he bought a piece of black bread to hastily fill his stomach, leaving him with almost nothing. He lodged in the stables of an inn, intending to try his luck again the next day. Kevin had tried to sell his salt at the salt shop, but the price was ridiculously low. Selling it to them at that price would definitely result in a huge loss. His attempt to bargain was quickly thwarted by the shopkeeper. Just as he was pondering what to do, he caught a glimpse of someone carrying an iron bucket and a brush approaching. Kevin guessed it was probably the city hall about to paint some slogans again. This was a propaganda tactic invented by the young lord who had only ascended the throne last year, painting so-called slogans in prominent public areas to let people understand his policies through concise text. Things like protecting the environment is everyone's responsibility and littering will be punished severely. Even their remote little village had a few slogans painted on it, though the number of literate people in their village could be counted on one hand. Seeing the man carrying the bucket approaching, Kevin muttered a curse about his bad luck and quickly packed up his things, moving his stall to another location to make room against the wall. The city hall staff came to the wall, dipped their brushes in paint, and began painting the surface. A crowd gathered to watch. Kevin joined the crowd, tapping on the shoulder of someone intently looking at the wall, and asked, "Sir, what does it say on the wall?" The man was so absorbed in his reading, he probably recognized the words. The man turned and glanced at him, replying, "Don't you recognize it? It says be vigilant, guard against spies, guard against spies." Kevin was a little confused. He knew what spies did, but why was such a slogan suddenly painted? "Yes, don't you know the recent situation?" "What situation?" the man said mysteriously. "War is about to begin. The lords are going to fight again." "War? Why would there be war out of the blue?" Kevin frowned. He had heard from his elders since he was a child about the horrors of war. When war broke out, lords would lead their troops to plunder each other's territories, impose war taxes on their own people, and forcibly conscript civilians into the army. The closest he had ever come to war was the last pirate invasion, and the old people in the village said that war was even more terrifying than pirate raids. "I heard that this time it's war with Emden." "Emden? I've heard that's a very powerful territory to our south. What's there to be afraid of?" Have you forgotten how our Lord Gleman thrashed those pirates and the traitors of Barden? The man speaking to Kevin was extremely excited, clearly very confident in all his military, and he gestured wildly when talking about the young lord. Kevin scoffed inwardly. Franklin Harbor, at least, had a city wall protecting it, but their village had no defenses whatsoever. He turned and walked towards his stall, muttering, "War, war. We salt farmers are starving, and they're still fighting." A man nearby overheard him, his eyes gleaming. Kevin continued tending his stall for a while, but finally couldn't hold on any longer. He didn't even have the energy to hawk his wares to passers-by. He weighed the few copper coins in his hand, reluctantly deciding to buy a piece of bread to stave off hunger, and then go to the well for a few sips of cool water. Just as he got up and took a few steps, someone called out to him. "Is this your stall?" Kevin immediately turned around and replied, "Yes, yes. This is my stall. Are you here to buy salt?" He recognized the man, of average height and build, with an ordinary face. "Excuse me, what's the price of your salt?" Kevin hesitated for a moment, then quoted the lowest price he could accept. The man hesitated and said, "It's much more expensive than what you sell in stores." Kevin became anxious. "Sir, my salt is a bit pricey, but it's of superior quality. It's all hand-boiled in our village, carefully ground and sifted. It's almost as good as the refined salt that noblemen eat. Look at the salt in the stores, the grains are coarse, and it contains so much sand. The taste is many times worse than mine." The man stroked his chin, seemingly considering Kevin's words. He dipped his finger in the salt and tasted it. You're right, the taste is indeed much better than what you sell in stores." Hearing this, hope appeared in Kevin's eyes. "Then, sir, I'm thinking about it too. We do need to buy salt for our store. Since your salt is of good quality, we'll buy it from you. Just this bag." He pointed to a bag of salt and said to Kevin, "All right, I'll tie it up for you right away." Kevin quickly tied the bag and handed it to the customer, who readily paid. The customer inquired, "I've never seen you before, are you new here?" I just started selling salt here yesterday. Will you continue selling here, as long as you need salt?" "Sir, I'll come to sell salt." "Good, if you like it, I'll continue to patronize you." He patted Kevin on the shoulder, picked up the bag of salt, and turned to leave. Kevin carefully shook the small bag full of coins. The crisp clinking sound filled his heart with happiness. Finally, he could have a full meal today. "I've been on a business trip to Jiangsu these past 2 days, so please forgive the lack of updates. Sigh, it's almost Chinese New Year and suddenly this happens." Chapter 234. For a long time, two types of lords have existed in the northwest bay of the Kingdom of Aldo. One type is the native lords, most of whom trace their lineage back to military leaders or religious nobles of various tribes that inhabited the area in ancient times. Their ancestors have been rooted in the Northwest Bay since the dawn of human civilization, although scholars have determined that their ancestors also migrated from the central plains of Aldo to the northwest. Another group were enfeoffed here by various regimes before the Rodney dynasty, but they too have a long history of residing in the Northwest Bay. Some families were even enfeoffed there during the ancient Bella Empire. The most powerful of these lords is the Ferdinand family, and the other native lords are essentially vassals or vassals of vassals. The other type is the foreign lords, whose ancestors were enfeoffed in the Northwest Bay after the establishment of the Rodney dynasty. During the unification of Aldo by the new dynasty, more than half of the original lords of the Northwest Bay pledged allegiance to the new royal family. However, a smaller portion of the lords, failing to grasp the situation, were purged, and their vacated territories were bestowed upon meritorious followers by the Rodney royal family. These new lords, appointed by the Rodney royal family, were tasked not only with guarding the frontiers but also with monitoring the native lords. For a long time, the old and new factions of lords kept each other in check. The Gleman family was a special case. Their original fiefdom was in the fertile Central Plains, but they chose the wrong side in political struggles and were relegated to the Northwest Bay by the royal family. Their new fiefdom was essentially unclaimed land, meaning the Gleman family was, in a sense, also under surveillance. The Northwest Bay had a total of 12 earls, 6 of whom were vassals of the Ferdinand family, and 6 others were vassals directly appointed by the royal family. The strength of the various earls varied greatly. The most powerful Kent family, in addition to its own direct territories, had 10 viscountries as vassals, while the, previously, weakest, the Gleman family, had neither a second-tier vassal nor even a formal knightly fief. As for the other viscountries and baronies, they were basically vassals of the Duke of the Northwest or the 12 Earls. Currently, the situation in the Northwest Bay was as follows. 5 of the 6 earls granted by the royal family had formed an alliance against the Kent family, led by Earl Parker, while the Kent family had rallied 3 other earls, also vassals of the Ferdinand family, to form a rival alliance. The remaining 3 earls were ambiguous in their stance and had not yet clearly chosen sides. Although the Kent family appeared to be at a disadvantage, Maltz Kent, who controlled Earl Ferdinand, could use the power of the Duke's direct territories and other vassals in the name of the Duke. Some of these viscountries were quite powerful, with populations comparable to those of nominal earls like Arda. Therefore, in terms of absolute strength, Maltz Kent's side held the advantage. Don't worry. Many of the lords under the Duke believe the letter is genuine. As long as we can withstand Maltz Kent's offensive, they will come to our aid from the rear. At a meeting, Earl Parker shook a stack of letters, revealing his seemingly unreliable trump card. In late March, the 2 factions, already sharpening their knives, launched attacks on each other almost simultaneously. Maltz Kent issued an ultimatum to the lords who had refused to obey his summons, demanding they meet in Sand City within 3 days, or face punishment for insulting the Duke. The anti-Kent alliance, not to be outdone, publicly displayed the Duke's secret letter, simultaneously bringing Viscount Henry to the forefront. Viscount Henry, long kept under Earl Parker's secret protection, caused a public uproar in the Northwest Bay with the secret letter and Viscount Henry's appearance. Maltz Kent immediately declared the letter a forgery. He explained that Henry Ferdinand, harboring resentment for not becoming heir to the dukedom, had escaped from the dukedom and framed him. A group of treacherous individuals, led by Earl Parker, had always harbored disloyal intentions, and the 2 sides conspired against him. He had used the minor mage Andy to control Duke Ferdinand, forcing him to hold a public gathering in Sand City, repeatedly proclaiming this. However, privately, Earl Kent was still somewhat fearful. He had anticipated Henry would seek refuge with his opponents, but he hadn't expected such consequences. And the secret letter in his possession matched his actions and plans perfectly. Could it really have been written by Duke Ferdinand? Could Master Barnett's control spell have a flaw? At this thought, a sharp pain shot through Maltz Kent's head, and he naturally thought, how could this be? How could Master Barnett's spell have a flaw? Praise be to Master Barnett, praise be to the Mystic Order. Duke Ferdinand is clearly under his tight control. That's it. It must be the damned Henry, forging his brother's handwriting. As for why the contents of the letter match the facts, it must be a coincidence. It must be a coincidence. But, why are so many lords following that old scoundrel Price Parker against him? These guys are usually so obsequious to him, their words dripping with sycophancy, yet now they dare to oppose him. He had anticipated 1 or 2 troublemakers, like that old codger Price Parker, but with his ducal authority, they wouldn't pose any real threat. After purging the lords still loyal to the royal family, he could establish himself in the Northwest Bay and stab the kingdom in the back while the government's attention is focused on the south. However, it now seems that Henry Ferdinand's escape and his forged secret letter have alerted the outsiders, the local lords' private term for the newly appointed royal lords, causing them to band together prematurely, rendering the original plan impossible. The Earl was filled with regret at this thought. He should have used the Duke's birthday banquet as an excuse to detain all these potential enemies. Although the subsequent handling would have been more complicated, it would have been much easier than the current situation. Now, regret was useless, only the battlefield could prove them right. After a long period of preparation, both factions had amassed considerable military forces. They deployed their troops, and war was imminent. However, neither side had forgotten the existence of the royal family. The anti-Kent alliance, needless to say, would certainly involve the royal family, and the Earl of Kent needed to temporarily feign loyalty to the kingdom. Both sides simultaneously sent their envoys to Crystal Radiance, presenting the true situation to His Majesty the King, requesting royal support, and informing the rest of the kingdom that the other was a traitor. Wishing all our readers a happy Chinese New Year. May all your wishes come true, everything go smoothly, and may your success rise like sesame seeds blooming higher and higher. Chapter 235. Before His Majesty's decision could even be reached, the 2 major factions in the Northwest Bay had already made their move. Beethoven, one of the Kent family's vassal states, was nestled between the territories of Earl Malkin and Viscount Johnston, making it an obvious target for the anti-Kent alliance. Therefore, after the two sides officially broke off relations, the Malkin and Johnston families immediately besieged Beethoven. However, Beethoven's defenses were extremely strong, and the two families were unable to break through it for the time being. Meanwhile, according to intelligence, the Kent family had quickly assembled reinforcements and was advancing towards the area. Earl Parker immediately wrote to the other lords in the alliance, summoning them to Beethoven to support the Malkin and Johnston families. The Lord of Bittoburg is related to the Kent family by marriage. Maltz Kent will definitely deploy a large force to relieve Bittoburg, and our intelligence confirms this. We must seize this opportunity to engage them in a decisive battle at Bittoburg, to annihilate a large portion of their forces in one fell swoop. This will give us better control over the future situation. Chief Secretary Bernard Wood stood with both hands, holding a letter and reading its contents clearly. Opposite him sat Paul Gleman. This region is extremely important. If it remains in the Kent family's hands, they can use it as a springboard to invade the land between Bittoburg and the Gulf Coast, cutting us in two. Hearing this, Paul's brows furrowed immediately. The Chief Secretary continued reading, based on the current known size of the enemy forces, I request that the Gleman and Garnard families immediately send at least 1,000 soldiers to Beethoven to join forces with the other families and defeat them in one fell swoop. May God bless us. That's it, Lord. It's signed Earl Price Parker. This must be a letter he wrote himself. Would you like to read it again? Paul rubbed his temples, a slight headache in his eyes, and said, No need, Bernard, put the letter away. He quite disliked this feeling, always feeling like he was being led by the nose. But Earl Parker was the organizer of the entire alliance, and his request had to be taken seriously. He should hurry back to Laketown and discuss it with the military high command. Paul was currently sitting in a room in the Port Authority building of Franklin Harbor. His purpose in coming to Franklin Harbor was to inspect the fleet equipped with new all-sail merchant ships. After establishing a solid cooperative relationship with the Foster family of Horn Bay, the Foster family sent several batches of shipwrights, greatly increasing the shipyard's production capacity. It was no longer the small shipyard that could only repair and build a few small galleys. Thanks to the craftsmen's overtime work and the Navy's concessions, the shipyard has built 4 larger merchant ships in the past few months. Compared to the warships built before, these merchant ships have undergone many improvements in cargo transport capabilities. They are larger, have a higher cargo capacity, and feature 2 masts on the deck, with a horizontal sail instead of the previous fore and aft sails. Of these 4 merchant ships, Paul kept 2 for himself, and sold the other 2 to the ship merchant Mr. Bennett Todd. Today is the day the 4 merchant ships are about to set sail. Paul's 2 ships will carry a large quantity of porcelain and printed books to Horn Bay, while Mr. Todd's 2 ships will carry a large quantity of canned goods and salt to the southern port closest to the royal capital, Jingaeo. They have chosen the same date for their first voyages. Bernard took out his pocket watch and checked it, reminding Paul, My lord, the merchant ships are about to depart, don't you think? Is that so? Let's go right away. From the window of the port office building, he could already see the dense crowd of people seeing them off on the dock. Upon seeing the lord's arrival, the crowd quickly made way. Paul, slightly excited, approached the merchant ships still moored in their berths. With these ships, his long-awaited ocean trade could finally begin. Naval Commander Austin and ship merchant Bennett Todd were already standing on the dock, waiting for his arrival. Mr. Todd bowed to him first. Your lordship, these merchant ships you have built are truly fascinating. Thank you. They are exactly what ship merchants like myself need. After the new year, the Council of State sent a business delegation to the capital, composed of merchants from Arda and Barden, all of whom, of course, had cooperated with the Lord's mansion. During this trip to the capital, the merchants used every trick in the book to promote their factory products to the powerful and wealthy of Jingaeo. After all the effort, canned goods and salt secured the most orders. After all, the royal army was about to march south to quell the rebellion, and canned food, convenient, easy to preserve, and with a decent taste, was naturally the general's preferred military supplies. Meanwhile, Bennett Todd's 2 merchant ships accepted commissions from other merchants to transport goods south by sea. Paul waved his hand. Not at all, I just offered a suggestion. These ships were all painstakingly built by the shipyard's craftsmen. You should thank them if you want. Mr. Todd nodded repeatedly in agreement. He knew that the count before him had an unusual concern for the working class. A simple ceremony was held at the dock to bid farewell to the 4 merchant ships. Paul took the stage and reiterated the importance of ocean trade and the State Council's strong support for private commercial and industrial activities. After the ceremony, 4 merchant ships set sail amidst farewells, slowly sailing away from Franklin Harbor into the distance. As they left the dock, Austin and Paul walked together, discussing for a while the newly opened Naval Academy. Finally, Austin quietly asked, "Lord Gleman, what opportunities will our Navy have to play in the upcoming war?" Paul thought for a moment. Although the Kent family controlled mostly inland territories, the Navy still had a role to play, such as deploying sailors ashore as infantry, like the Russians. "Austin," Paul said, "we may face a shortage of manpower in the short term. You can organize the fleet to continuously patrol the Weiss River. Once you receive a distress call from nearby land, immediately send sailors ashore to provide support. So, have your men strengthen their firearms training. The current army cannot yet maintain tight border control. Sending troops to cooperate with Earl Parker would make the situation even more dire. He needs a relatively mobile force to deal with unforeseen circumstances." Chapter 236 Military Camp Life. In response to Earl Parker's urgent request, Paul returned to Lakeside Town that very day. He immediately summoned high-ranking military officers, including Schroeder and Bryce, to discuss sending reinforcements to Bittoburg. Chief of Staff Schroeder strongly supported sending reinforcements, pointing at a map of the Northwest Bay and explaining the significance of the expedition. Earl Parker's letter is correct. Bittoburg is located between the Portree and Adela territories, only a day and a night's journey from here to the coast. If the Kent family uses this as a springboard to occupy such a small area, then the 3 territories of Arda, Byron, and Larnaca will be completely isolated from the heart of the kingdom, at least on land. This is unacceptable for us at present. Paul stared intently at the map, where Bittoburg stood like a nail driven into the border between Portree and Adela. Schroeder is right. It is too dangerous for this place to remain in the hands of the Kent family. Arda has just launched 4 merchant ships, and sea transport cannot completely replace land transport. If the land transport routes are cut off, it will be a major blow to Arda's trade activities. He explained his plan. "I intend to send the 1st Infantry Battalion, the 3rd Infantry Battalion, and an artillery company to provide support, with a transport company responsible for the logistical support of these units. The 2nd Infantry Battalion will remain in Arda to handle any unforeseen circumstances." "Do you all have any opinions?" Bryce asked. "Isn't leaving just 1 infantry battalion too few?" Schroeder's words dispelled his doubts. "The Navy can send a battalion of sailors ashore to assist in the defense. The cannons on the warships can be dismantled and deployed on land, and we can also mobilize militia from various places." "How many militia are currently capable of fighting?" Schroeder replied. "The General Staff conducted a survey of the militia in various places before the advent, and we can use the militia to build a temporary force of 2,000 men, with an organization level no lower than the regular soldiers we used to deal with the pirates last year." Just as dawn was breaking, a loud reveille resounded throughout the camp, and Private Joss opened his eyes to the thunderous roar of his Sergeant Makarov. "Get up now, you bunch of lazybones!" The sergeant yanked off their blankets one by one, dragging the soldiers out of bed. "The barracks aren't like your own homes. There are strict rules about the schedule, and you must always remember that you are now proud soldiers of Arda." The 3rd Infantry Battalion was officially formed last year. To quickly achieve combat readiness, the General Staff transferred a group of officers and veterans from the original 2 battalions to supplement the 3rd Battalion as core personnel. The vacancies in the 1st and 2nd Battalions were filled by recruiting from local militias who already had some training. Sergeant Makarov, who had been stationed in the village of Cass to train the militia, was transferred back to the 1st Infantry Battalion, along with 10 young men from Cass, including Joss. The recruited militia were scattered and assigned to various companies. To Joss's utter frustration, his squad leader was none other than Sergeant Makarov, whom he feared like a tiger. He still vividly remembered the look Sergeant Makarov gave him during the first assembly of the entire class. "It's you again, fine. I'll keep a close eye on you." The sergeant's bell-like eyes conveyed this message. Joss silently prayed that he would have a safe passage through his military career. After quickly straightening his clothes, Joss followed his unit to the parade ground for assembly. Before breakfast, there was a half-hour morning run and a half-hour standing at attention. Each unit, organized by company, ran in unison around the barracks, accompanied by their commander's whistle. Each company had its own morale-boosting slogans, and during the run, all sorts of strange slogans rose and fell in the barracks, each louder than the last, trying to overwhelm the other companies in terms of momentum. For someone like Joss, who had some militia training, especially with a devilish instructor like Sergeant Makarov, running for half an hour straight wasn't a problem. After half an hour, he was only slightly out of breath. However, some recruits with weaker physical constitutions ran until their faces were flushed and they were panting heavily. Fortunately, these recruits had already been training in the barracks for some time, and none of them fell behind. Joss remembered that during the first morning run, some people fainted on the ground. Others, panting heavily, didn't want to continue running or tried to sneak back to the barracks, and were then whipped mercilessly by officers, their teeth chattering on the ground. They were also punished by not being allowed to eat breakfast and had to stand at attention again after finishing their morning run. "What will I eat this morning?" After finishing his morning run, Joss stood motionless, slowly calming his breathing while thinking about what breakfast would be like. Standing at attention for half an hour would give him time to rest and let his mind wander. The soldiers stood in neat rows on the parade ground, each company having its own designated area. From the high platform, the scene on the parade ground was magnificent. The soldiers' ranks were straight lines both horizontally and vertically. The daily military posture training filled the officers supervising the morning exercises with a sense of pride. They firmly believed that no other army in this era could perform better than the one before them, at least in terms of formation. From stopping their morning runs to entering the parade ground in turn, regrouping, and forming squares, all the companies took less than half an hour, a feat almost impossible for other armies. The Lord's emphasis on formation training from the very beginning of establishing this standing army was somewhat perplexing to them. Of course, no one would argue that such training was unimportant. Impeccable formation was a necessary foundation for a high-quality army, a truth that had held true since ancient times. They simply felt that the count was overemphasizing it, and that allocating more time to individual combat training would have been far better. However, when faced with a surging tide of pirates and the thunderous attack from behind by the Bayhorn Knights, rigorous formation training proved invaluable. Although many soldiers inevitably showed signs of panic or tension, strict discipline prevented them from moving without orders, and the long-cultivated obedience made their bodies act instinctively upon receiving commands. But strict discipline and arduous training alone were insufficient. Adequate material support was also essential. After standing motionless for half an hour, a dizzy and disoriented Joss joined his company in queuing for food at the mess hall. Black bread, beef stew with potatoes, boiled eggs, beet porridge. Enjoy, rookie. Next, the cooks deftly placed breakfast on trays. Joss sniffed. The aroma of the food whetted his appetite, instantly erasing the fatigue of the morning's training. Besides timely pay, the abundant meals were a major reason attracting many young men to join the army. With such intense training, inadequate nutrition was unacceptable. While the food provided to the Alda army could not compare to that of wealthy families, it was certainly above the standard of ordinary civilian families in the Northwest Bay. For soldiers like Joss, who came from rural backgrounds, it was a luxury they had never experienced before. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 237 Target, Bittelberg. Raise your guns, ready, aim, fire. With the company commander's order to fire, a series of loud crackling sounds rang out, and a thick plume of white smoke rose from the parade ground. Joss, enduring the choking smoke, hurriedly retreated to the third rank with his comrades, frantically pulling out cardboard-loaded ammunition and loading it. After a few maneuvers, he pulled out the cleaning rod, inserted it into the barrel to tamp the ammunition, and then stood ready to fire. Idiot. You forgot to pull the cleaning rod out again. Do you want to fire it out with it? A low, exasperated shout came from beside him. Sergeant Makarov, the squad leader, stood in the same rank. As a veteran, he was the first to finish loading his ammunition and then habitually checked the loading procedures of the others in his squad. He immediately noticed that Joss had forgotten to remove the cleaning rod. Sorry, Sergeant. Joss slapped his forehead in frustration, pulled out the firing rod under Makarov's stern gaze, and nervously awaited the company commander's order to fire. Joss's company had been assigned shooting practice that morning. Under the officer's commands, He repeatedly performed mechanical actions. At first, he was excited when he touched the musket. Sergeant Makarov had said that this weapon could make a large gash in an enemy's body with just a flick of the finger, even if the enemy was wearing armor. A divine weapon. During his first shot, seeing the single hole punch through the wooden plank in front of him, Joss couldn't help but marvel. However, after several training sessions, the initial excitement had vanished, leaving only a cautious reluctance to make a mistake. Sujin, fire. Forward, marching. Just as the company commander was about to move on to the next exercise, a messenger ran across the parade ground, blowing a whistle and shouting, "1st Battalion, assemble! 1st Battalion, assemble!" The company on the parade ground immediately stopped its current training and quickly formed ranks to proceed to the assembly area. Other personnel who had not participated in training also rushed to the assembly point upon hearing the order. "Sergeant, are we going to the front lines?" Joss quietly asked Makarov beside him, recalling the discussions he had overheard in the mess hall at breakfast. The sergeant replied, "Perhaps, perhaps not, but whatever the order, we have to obey." Everyone in the unit knew that Arda was now caught in the crossfire between the two factions in the Northwest Gulf, and they would be sent to the battlefield sooner or later. The sudden increase in training intensity since February undoubtedly confirmed this. The two battalions were assembled, with over 1,000 men from the 1st and 2nd Infantry Battalions standing neatly in formation on the parade ground. Soldiers from the artillery and transport companies were also present. Several officers walked onto the reviewing stand. Joss recognized the two leading officers as Lieutenant Colonel Bryce, commander of the 1st Battalion, and Major Joyce, commander of the 3rd Battalion. "Soldiers, the day to test your training results has finally arrived." Bryce seemed extremely excited, his voice unusually loud. "As you've probably guessed, we are about to engage in a fierce battle. The foolish enemy has delivered himself to our doorstep. Is war really coming?" The men below murmured to themselves. "First, we must identify our enemy. Yes, it is the Kent family, who humiliated us last year. This insidious family severely insulted Arda and Barden last year, yet we forgave them out of our magnanimous neighborly nature. But unexpectedly, their patriarch, Maltz Kent, has this year committed the heinous crime of usurping the ducal title and even attempting to launch a rebellion against the kingdom, an unforgivable crime. We have formed a powerful alliance with the territories of Larnaca, Stanlow, and Portree, vowing to annihilate the Kent family and their followers. We are honored that the brave 1st and 3rd Battalions have been selected as the first troops to set out, while the loyal artillery and transport companies will serve as our solid support. We will, as the Lord's sword, plunge fiercely into the heart of the enemy. Let those scum left behind by the Father at the beginning of creation know that we are not to be trifled with. Let them tremble with fear at the mere mention of our name, like maggots in the sewers meeting the sunlight." Lieutenant Colonel Bryce, waving his large hand and spitting as he addressed the soldiers, declared, "I now order all troops to begin preparations immediately. Pack your supplies, weapons, and ammunition. We'll depart first thing tomorrow morning." For an entire day, the two selected infantry battalions were engaged in this intense preparation. Early the next morning, the entire army assembled again on the parade ground and departed Lakeside Town, heading south towards Bittoburg. The townspeople lined the streets to see off the departing troops, shouting slogans like "Teach the Emdens a lesson," and "Long live Arda." The state council sent propaganda personnel who spent their days blaring through loudspeakers. "If we don't take Bittoburg, the trade routes will be cut off, goods won't sell, and you'll all lose your jobs. The Emdens will invade and enslave us all. They'll steal our money and insult our sisters." The propaganda methods were primitive yet effective, as the target audience was largely uninformed townspeople who had only recently learned a few words during the literacy campaign. Thanks to the various factories that have opened over the past year, many townspeople who have become workers have seen a significant increase in income and a much better quality of life. The thought that Summerall might destroy everything they have is truly unbearable for the people. Thus, everyone has reached a consensus. Bryce will be the supreme commander for this operation. Although he displayed great enthusiasm on the parade ground yesterday, he was still quite apprehensive until the moment of departure. This is his first time commanding an entire army independently. It's not that he's worried about his abilities. The Arda army is well trained and equipped with advanced weaponry. As long as he performs at his usual training level, while he might not be able to determine the outcome of the battle, he should be able to defend himself on the battlefield. Paul has been striving to build an army that can remain invincible even with a mediocre commander. What he worries about is his identity, a rogue knight without official rank. Will he be ridiculed by other lords and knights there? Have the two prestigious Earls of Arda and Bardon run out of capable men? At the meeting, Bryce strongly recommended Chief of Staff Schroeder to command the expedition, given his status as a true knight. However, Paul declined, arguing that Schroeder needed to remain at the General Staff to oversee the overall operation. The Earl told him, "Go, Bryce. Everyone has to do it once." Bryce was deeply grateful for Paul's trust and felt a heavy responsibility, as this was the first official appearance of Arden's new army before the various territories. The previous suppression of pirates and the quelling of the Bardon rebellion in the Northwest Bay hadn't garnered much attention. The townspeople's enthusiasm also infected Bryce. "This Battle of Bittoburg is a great opportunity to demonstrate our strength," his anxiety subsided. Although the military council's decision was to assist allies as much as possible while preserving ourselves, Bryce was determined to deliver a stellar performance. He wanted to announce Arden's resurgence to the other lords, establish the Gleman's reputation, and ensure they could no longer underestimate this exiled family. The lieutenant colonel on horseback pointed south. Target, Bittoburg. Chapter 238 Rash Attack. Chapter 235. Located between the Portree and Adela territories, Bitto Castle was a formidable fortress. Its owner, Baron Bright Sean, was one of the vassals of the Kent family. After the two major factions of the Northwest Bay clashed, Earl Morley Malkin and Viscount Dylan Johnston immediately joined forces and besieged Bitto Castle. Viscount Sean had made preparations in advance, storing large quantities of food within the castle, repairing defensive equipment, and recruiting and training a large army. With these preparations, he commanded the castle's garrison to hold out tenaciously, repeatedly thwarting the Allied offensives. Morley Malkin and Dylan Johnston were forced to seek help from other lords in their alliance, which led to Price Parker's letter to the lords. The people of Bitto Castle, naturally, would not sit idly by. They sent a message by carrier pigeon to Earl Kent, requesting him to gather the strength of their allies to relieve the siege. Military forces from both sides began to gradually converge on the castle. In a village near Beacon Castle, members of the Anti-Kent League chose it as their temporary command post. "If you ask me, we should send them a challenge right now and arrange a fair fight tomorrow." In the largest house in the village, a young man pounded the table impatiently. "Don't rush. Let's see what they do first, and then we'll see what happens," Morley Malkin advised, inwardly complaining that Winifred Heller's son was far too belligerent. Unlike his father who championed non-violence, he'd heard that Earl Heller had initially wanted to observe the situation further, but it was this young man's efforts to persuade his elders that had gotten the Heller family involved. And now, this same young lad was leading the troops. Had his father been sidelined? Count Malkin also wanted to end the fighting on his doorstep as soon as possible and remove Bittoburg, this thorn in his side, but with enemy reinforcements pressing in, he had to be cautious. The others in the room echoed Count Malkin's sentiments. HMPH, Derek Heller snorted in dissatisfaction. In his view, these old men were far too conservative, their minds practically rusted. "I must remind you all," said Price Parker, seated at the head of the table, "that spring planting is about to begin. If we don't get the soldiers home to farm soon, we won't have a harvest in the fall." "Nephew Derek," he continued, "we understand what you're saying. That's why I have gathered you all here, hoping to defeat the Kent family in one decisive battle and prevent the war from dragging on. Since we're aiming for a decisive victory, we should maximize our own resources," Derek asked. "We've already gathered over 6,000 men. What more do we need?" "What are you waiting for? We're waiting for the Gleman and Garnered families. Over 1,000 of them haven't arrived yet. With them, our chances of victory will be much greater," Derek scoffed. "I've heard that the Gleman family doesn't even have a single knight. What help can they be?" Earl Parker shook his head. "Even a small mosquito is still meat. Besides, we can't underestimate them. Do you really have the confidence to wipe out the pirates of the Northwest Bay in just a few months with only your own family's strength?" Derek tossed his hair. "HMPH, just some peripheral pirate gangs left behind after Edward left. What's so difficult about wiping out this rabble?" The people in the room looked at Earl Parker somewhat awkwardly. As the initiator of the alliance, Price Parker felt somewhat offended. He slammed his hand on the table and said in a commanding voice, "Anyone who thinks we should wait for Griles and Garnard's men to arrive before starting the war, raise your hand." Except for Derek Heller, everyone else present raised their right hands. Earl Parker nodded in satisfaction and turned to Derek. saying, "Nephew Derek, it seems everyone agrees. Do you still want to stick to your opinion?" Seeing no one support him, Derek was furious. He suppressed his anger and asked, "All right, I respect everyone's opinion. But when will the Gleman and Garnered families arrive? If they don't come for a month, are we supposed to wait? But by then, the Kent family will have already attacked." Seeing that the young man was softening his tone, Earl Parker stroked his beard and said, "You don't need to worry about that. I've already received their messenger. Their troops are on their way and should arrive by tomorrow afternoon." At this moment, Bitburg was experiencing the final moments of calm before the great battle. The Allied forces had gathered over 6,000 men, setting up camp to the east of the castle, isolating Bitburg from the Kent family's reinforcements. The Kent family's forces had also gathered nearly 5,000 men, setting up camp not far to the east of the Allied forces, awaiting the arrival of their reinforcements. Given their presence, the Allied forces halted their siege. The defenders of Bitburg numbered less than 1,000 capable fighters and were unable to form a pincer movement with their reinforcements. Both sides were giving their armies a final push, awaiting the moment when the battle would ignite. The next day at noon, Earl Parker was discussing the upcoming battle with others when a soldier stumbled in. "Lord Parker, sir." The soldier seemed flustered. The Earl glared at him disapprovingly. "What's the panic? What happened?" "Viscount Derek Heller, the Viscount has led his troops to attack the other side." "What?" Price Parker and the others in the hall were shocked and furious. The Earl made the soldier repeat himself to confirm he hadn't misheard. "That lad. How could you be so reckless? They thought he'd been behaving himself yesterday. Turns out it was all an act." The soldier who came in to report added, "It seems the enemy camp is on fire, causing a commotion." The Viscount, seeing this as an opportunity, led his men to attack. "Oh." Earl Parker immediately led his men out of the house and looked eastward. The soldier was right. Several plumes of smoke were rising in the east, clearly a fire. He slammed his fist on his palm. Sigh. Did he consider what if it was a trap? Maybe they were already lying in ambush in the camp. There was no time to lose. Whether it was a trap or not, he had to do something. He looked around at everyone and made an immediate decision. "Gentlemen, assemble the soldiers according to the formation we discussed and practiced before, approach the enemy camp, and support Viscount Derek Heller." "Yes, sir," the others responded, and then immediately dispersed to gather their respective troops. Chapter 239 A Glimmer of Hope. Almost there. Derek Heller felt a surge of excitement as he watched the rising plume of smoke. The enemy camp was in chaos due to the fire. The soldiers were frantically searching for water to extinguish the flames. If he could just rush in and wreak havoc, it would be like a lion pouncing on a flock of sheep. His fame would be decided today. Not long ago, Derek, patrolling the camp, had noticed something amiss in the enemy's direction. His scouts, tasked with close surveillance, quickly reported that the Kent family's camp was on fire. Eager for glory, Derek immediately thought of a surprise attack amidst the chaos. Although such an action was unknightly, what was the point of morality with such despicable and shameless men as the Kent family? His subordinates suggested he consult with the other lords who were in a meeting, but Derek immediately rejected the suggestion. Those old-fashioned fellows will definitely discuss it for ages, and by the time they decide to attack, the enemy will have already put out their fire. Of course, it's more likely they'll continue to wait for Gleman and Garnered, who's probably dawdling somewhere, so Derek quickly returned to his camp and gathered all the troops he had brought from Portree, including 100 knights, 300 squires, and over 1,000 militia. Cavalry charge into the enemy camp and create chaos. Infantry follow. Derek quickly issued orders to his troops. Having received a noble education from a young age and being well versed in military history, he knew many examples of victories against overwhelming odds. Today was a golden opportunity, and he was confident he could replicate those historical miracles. He didn't forget to send scouts to reconnoiter the area around the enemy camp, especially the small grove to the south, which seemed like a good place for ambushes. But eager for battle, he didn't wait for the scouts to return before leading his knights in an attack. War is a gamble, after all. The Kent family's camp lacked elaborate defenses, seemingly serving only as a temporary encampment, with a few simple rows of scouts positioned around its perimeter. A few knights spearheaded the charge, using their lances to clear the scouts one by one, creating an opening. The main force, following closely behind at a trot, immediately spurred their horses and launched a full-scale attack. As Derek had anticipated, their attack only exacerbated the already chaotic situation for the enemy, who were busy fighting fires, further plunging the camp into disarray. Kill! The Heller family's knights and squires fiercely brandished their weapons, reaping the lives of enemy soldiers. After nearly 20 minutes of frantic fighting, the Kent family's army gradually recovered. Knights and officers donned their armor and led their men in a counterattack. Derek's cavalry, including knights and squires, numbered less than 200, and suffered casualties in the ensuing counterattack. Why haven't the infantry caught up yet? As the enemy's counterattack intensified, Derek, his blood boiling with rage, gradually calmed down. He suddenly remembered the infantry following behind the cavalry. Viscount Heller. Surrender! A shout suddenly came from the west, the direction he had come from. Derek looked over and saw it was Earl Kent's son, Jace. You're the one who should surrender. You can't fool. Seeing Derek refuse, Jace sneered, HMPH. You won't admit defeat until you see the coffin. Look at this. He raised his arm and threw an object, which rolled to the ground beneath Derek's horse. Derek knew immediately that something terrible had happened. It was a helmet, the helmet of one of his knights, whom he had previously assigned to command infantry. Had he been killed? Or captured? Where had the Kent army behind them come from? Were they lying in ambush in the woods? Or were they reinforcements that had just arrived? None of that mattered now. What mattered was that they were quickly surrounded. The enemy forces around them were growing larger and larger. Break out! Derek shouted the order, and the troops, who had been fighting independently, regrouped and formed a tight formation. There are fewer people to the north. Break through there. Protect the Viscount. The family knight commander charged ahead, brandishing a flail, into the enemy ranks, followed closely by Derek and the other knights. The Kent family army, located to the north of the camp, consisted mostly of conscripted infantry, who were no match for the combined charge of the knights. Many were trampled into a bloody pulp, and many more simply scattered and fled. These conscripts were utterly useless, Jace thought angrily, whipping his horsewhip in the air. He ordered a knight beside him, Derek is stuck here, his allies won't stand idly by. Organize the infantry, and take a squadron of cavalry to hold them off. Then he led the cavalry behind him, spurring their horses to give chase. See? I told you it was a trap. Just as the allied lord had assembled his troops, scouts reported that a large contingent of heavy cavalry, arriving from the southern path, had routed the Heller family's infantry. Not necessarily. Since they came from the southern path, it's more likely that Kent's reinforcements have arrived and just happened to run into Heller's infantry. Whether it's a trap or not, if we don't go now, the Heller kid is finished. This young man shouldn't be so stubborn as to throw his life away. He should surrender if he should, and we can at least ransom him. Let's hope so, otherwise how will we explain to Earl Heller, HMPH? He brought it on himself, he can't blame us. The lords were extremely anxious. They left 1,000 men to keep watch on Beethoven's rear, and commanded the remaining 5,000 men to advance towards the enemy's encampment. On the way, they encountered a large group of routed Heller family infantry, pursued by enemy cavalry. Seeing the lord's reinforcements, they saw hope and quickly moved towards them. Viscount Johnston, in charge of the vanguard, shouted, Heller soldiers, listen up. Do not charge the lines. Otherwise, kill them on sight. But some of the routed soldiers continued to run towards them, shouting for help as they ran. The situation was urgent. Viscount Johnston decisively ordered, archers, fire. A volley of arrows rained down, striking many fleeing soldiers who had run close, while the rest scattered in cries of pain. Seeing the overwhelming numbers of the Allied forces, the pursuers also retreated. The Allied army continued its advance, only to encounter the main enemy infantry force, already arrayed in formation. They had been positioned by Jace to prevent the Allied forces from rescuing Derek. Without further ado, both sides engaged in battle. Derek's situation was extremely dire. He and his knights had broken through the encirclement and were heading north, hoping to find an opportunity to turn back to the Allied camp in the west. However, the pursuers seemed glued to their backs, and there were pursuers on their left and right rear. No matter which direction they turned, they risked being intercepted. Left with no other choice, Derek could only continue north. Damn it. Must I only surrender in humiliation and wait to be ransomed? No. Absolutely not. The Kent family, just you wait. I'll make you pay, he swore silently. But after the previous battle and the long gallop, his horse was exhausted, and its speed was noticeably decreasing. Damn it. Damn it. What's that? Just as Derek was filled with despair, dust billowed up from the road ahead. The dragon banner? That's the Gryle's army. An army appeared directly in front of them. Chapter 240 Encountering the enemy. The Arda army was marching along a dirt road across the plains. The weather was clear and sunny, although the March-April air in the Northwest Bay was slightly chilly. The soldiers were still drenched in sweat after a long march. Although it was past noon, the troops hadn't eaten yet. Since they were close to Fort Bitto, Commander Bryce decided to reach their destination first, set up camp, and then have the entire army eat. "Sergeant, when are we eating?" Joss rubbed his stomach, which was rumbling in protest. "We're almost at Bittoburg. We can have a delicious lunch there." "Honestly, you can't even handle this little bit of hunger." Makarov pulled a paper package from his backpack and tossed it to Joss. "One for each of you. Use this to tide you over." "Sergeant, what's this?" "Biscuits from the Flying Dragon Pavilion." "You bunch of bastards got a good deal." "Flying Dragon Pavilion? That new restaurant at the town entrance. I've been there. They say the cuisine is from some southern region. It's delicious. These biscuits are southern biscuits too." After munching on a bunch of biscuits, they heard singing coming from ahead. They didn't know who started it, but Joss and the others listened intently and recognized it as the recently popular Ode to My Lord Grammy in the army camp. "Paul Grammy, my lord, Count, mobilized the entire territory's soldiers, a company of 12 elite soldiers, 60 rounds of ammunition per man." He said, "Tough men. I look forward to fighting alongside you. The enemy covets our farmland and mines, and our gold vaults worth tens of thousands. Don't play the coward. Let the enemy know we're not to be trifled with." Although it sounded a bit silly and cute, the slightly humorous lyrics paired with a tune were indeed very suitable for marching. Joss's class also joined in the chorus, their steps unconsciously becoming lighter. "God's protection is like wind and thunder. Who doesn't know Lord Gleman and his soldiers? Goodbye dear Louise, don't cry. Not every arrow hits the mark. If every arrow hit the mark, then who would the Lord recruit as soldiers? We have cannons and muskets, one shot and a hole. We receive our pay on time every month. Who else can receive money on time like us? Lord Gleman, my lord hero with a shimmering laurel wreath. Your soldiers are forever the most loyal. As long as you continue to let us sweep away the enemy, we will overturn the whole world for you." After singing this, just as they were waiting for the second round to begin, a scream came. "It seems someone is running towards us." Joss and the others looked up and saw billowing dust rising on the road ahead, as if a large army was rushing towards them. A man on horseback, wearing the rank of second lieutenant, rode up to Lieutenant Colonel Bryce and stopped beside him. He appeared to be a scout who had been leading the way. Bryce rode a short distance from Makarov's squad. The two whispered to each other for a while, their conversation unclear. Makarov turned to his squad and said, "Everyone, prepare yourselves. There might be enemy ahead." Joss took the flintlock pistol from its sling, gripped it nervously, and his palms immediately became sweaty. Was his first real combat experience about to begin? Then Lieutenant Colonel Bryce became tense and serious. Two messengers beside him ran one after the other to either end of the marching column, shouting as they ran, "Enemy cavalry spotted! Form squares! Form squares!" The entire army was immediately enveloped in a tense and solemn atmosphere. Fortunately, their rigorous training had paid off. The leading company formed 3 horizontal lines, and the companies behind them followed in succession. In just over 10 minutes, the 1st and 2nd battalions each took charge of 2 sides, constructing a hollow square formation with sides approximately 30 meters long. Inside the formation, the transport company's supplies were laid out in the open space, and the soldiers of the transport company were also added to the formation. Besides the supplies, the artillery company was also positioned in the central open space. The artillery crews unloaded their cannons and ammunition, constructing firing positions. Due to the suddenness of the situation and the arrival of a high-speed cavalry assault, they didn't have time to set up the cannons outside the hollow square and had to retreat inside to prepare for firing, waiting for the opportune moment. After a period of tense activity, the Alda army awaited the enemy's arrival. Standing on a makeshift platform made of ammunition boxes, Bryce, Joyce, and the 2 deputy battalion commanders observed the situation ahead through binoculars. Judging from the banners, the ones charging ahead are the Heller family cavalry, and the 2 pursuing groups are undoubtedly the Kent family, our enemies. Could it be that our allies are all wiped out, with only these remnants left? Don't overthink it. Deal with the cavalry in front of us first, then we can deal with the Heller family. Derek Heller led his knights northward at breakneck speed. Because the terrain ahead was flat, He spotted the Alda army in the distance. At first, he thought it was an enemy force coming to ambush him. The enemy had transformed from a marching formation into a strange square formation in a very short time. Such a rapid change of formation indicated an extremely elite army, something his own conscripted militia could never achieve. Just as he was preparing to fight to the death, he gradually made out the banners of the army ahead, bright red banners with a golden dragon on them. It was the army of his ally, Alda. Derek suddenly felt a sense of relief, even though he had been complaining that the Alda army was inexplicably slow that morning. He raised his lance high, letting the Heller family banner attached to the lance flutter in the wind. Thankfully, the other side recognized him. A man standing high inside the phalanx, dressed like a general, kept waving his arm to the right. Derek understood, he was being told to pass through the phalanx from the right, which was the left for him, and not to get close. He understood this perfectly. In the face of danger, a breach in one's own formation could have dire consequences. So, with a wave of his hand, he led his knights to the left. The Heller family's troops quickly passed near the hollow phalanx. They were exhausted and needed to rest at the rear. As they passed the phalanx, Derek roughly estimated the Arda army's numbers at around 1,000. Worry returned to him. Could such a small force withstand the charge of several hundred Kent family cavalry? And their defensive phalanx wasn't even solid, it only had 3 thin layers of soldiers on the outside. Even more absurdly, the guns the soldiers are holding are way too short. Are they even guns? The design is so bizarre. Heavenly Father, bless them. Chapter 241 Hollow Square Array 1. Fix bayonets, fix bayonets. A clattering sound rang out as Arda soldiers drew their bayonets and sheathed them. Officers forward, Bryce roared, and his deputy, Joyce, immediately repeated his order. Officers forward. No one moved, because the officers of each company, platoon, and squad had already taken their positions at the very front of their ranks. The Kent cavalry drew ever closer, now less than 500 meters from the phalanx. Ready, ready. The outermost rank of soldiers on either side of the phalanx facing the cavalry immediately knelt on one knee. The second and third ranks remained standing, while the third rank passed their muskets through the gaps between the soldiers in front. All 3 ranks pointed their muskets forward. Hold your fire. Hold your fire, don't fire without orders, Makarov whispered a warning to those around him. Many people, especially raw recruits who had never seen battle, could resist firing prematurely when facing a rapidly advancing enemy. Joss nervously wiped his sweaty left hand on his body, then pulled the trigger again. He was left-handed when he first started using a musket. Everyone else held the gun with their left hand and pulled the trigger with their right, but he held the gun with his right and pulled the trigger with his left. After a period of training, this habit was forcibly corrected by Sergeant Makarov, who strictly adhered to the 1991 infantry training regulations, compiled and issued by the General Staff. However, in this tense moment with the enemy at hand, he unconsciously reverted to his original habit. He was assigned to the third rank, a favor for the new recruits, but correspondingly, his protection was less than that of the soldiers in the first 2 rank. Joss only wore a leather armor over his upper body, while the soldiers in the first 2 rank were mostly wearing metal armor for vital areas. After all, this was an era dominated by cold weapons, and given that he could produce large quantities of iron, Paul was not stingy in increasing the armor coverage of his troops to prepare for possible close combat. Jace's lips curled upwards, a contemptuous sneer playing on his lips. He recognized the banners of the army blocking his path, the banners of the Gleman family, the same minor lords who had nearly clashed with the Kent family last year. Paul Gleman. We spared you last year, and instead of being grateful, you dare to oppose us, Gleman. Look at your army. A mere 1,000-odd conscripted peasants, wielding laughable weapons that are neither sticks nor spears, and those horses are nothing more than drudgery for pulling carts. Oh. The formation is quite neat, but what good is it? He ordered his second-in-command to wave a banner, signaling another cavalry unit, to break the square formation from the left and right. Including knights and squires, his cavalry force numbered nearly 300 men. Although far fewer than the Arda army, Jace was confident that breaking this square would be effortless. Knights and peasants, the difference in fighting strength was like heaven and earth. The lead knight grabbed the javelin hanging from his horse. Unlike on earth, knights here didn't consider using ranged weapons despicable. Based on his past experience, he and his companions would simply throw their javelins, and the farmers who had just put down their hoes would either cower on the ground or scatter in all directions. Once the enemy formation was disrupted, They could rush in and trample them at will. Moreover, seeing that there weren't even any archers in the opposing square formation made him even more reassured. They could tease the enemy with impunity. However, even if there were archers, with the inferior bows and crossbows that ordinary soldiers were equipped with and their own thick armor, it would be difficult to inflict effective damage. Closer. Closer still. Bryce raised his sword high. In the Alda army, the four sides of a hollow square formation were designated front, back, left, and right. Now, the 4 battalion commanders, one for each side, were in charge, with Bryce commanding the vanguard. Finally, the first enemy rushed to within about 50 meters of the square formation, javelins raised, ready to fire. First rank, fire. The command sword fell swiftly, Bryce's order echoing throughout the square formation. Bang, 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 a continuous roar of muskets erupted, thick smoke immediately enveloping the front of the formation. The knights at the very front were instantly thrown from their horses, tumbling backward in their musket-raising positions. Oh no, the fallen knight instinctively tried to roll to the side. He didn't want to be trampled into mincemeat by his uncontrollable comrades behind him. But to his dismay, all his strength seemed to have vanished, making even turning over difficult. Wait, what just happened? The knight's mind realized something was wrong. He had only heard a loud noise, then felt as if he had been violently struck by something, and then fallen from his horse. What was it? He hadn't seen the trajectory of the attack. Suddenly, the knight felt a burning sensation rising in his right abdomen, and instinctively touched it. A gaping hole, the sensation in his hand startled him. The thing had pierced through his thick armor. Even more terrifying things followed. Pain, an increasingly intense pain, replaced the previous burning sensation, radiating throughout his body. Damn it! It hurts so much. The knight grabbed a handful of grass from his side and threw it into the air in frustration. What he saw was a horrifying sight. The withered grass, which should have been yellowed, was stained red by something. Second rank, fire. The Kent family cavalry following behind suffered the same fate as their comrades. The 2 battalions that had set out had been equipped with flintlock muskets. Without matchlocks, the soldiers were almost shoulder to shoulder, a major advantage being the greatly increased density of firepower during volleys. Some charging cavalrymen were hit, some their horses were hit, and some were hit by both. However, thanks to the accuracy of the smoothbow muskets, many escaped death. Some horses, startled by the gunfire, ran wildly, carrying their riders uncontrollably. However, some lucky knights still managed to reach the throwing range of their javelins and hurled them with all their might into the phalanx. Under the attack of these few knights, the Alda army suffered casualties. The wounded were immediately dragged to the open space in the center of the phalanx, where newly trained medics, who had mastered basic disinfection and bandaging techniques, immediately began to treat them. Third rank, fire. Bryce gave the order angrily, a sudden pang of heartache at seeing his hard-earned soldiers wounded. The third rank fired, wiping out a Kent family cavalry who had finished throwing their javelins and turned their horses to disengage. The first volley rendered nearly 50 enemy cavalrymen incapacitated. Chapter 242 Hollow Square Array 2. Joss shakily loaded his ammunition, glancing forward occasionally to observe the enemy's movements. In those brief seconds before firing, he experienced the most harrowing moment of his life. A javelin flew with lightning speed, striking his comrade beside him directly. The poor fellow was thrown like a ragdoll into the open space in the middle of the formation. Although he was immediately dragged away by medics, Joss estimated his unfortunate comrade was likely dead, as he clearly heard the sound of the javelin piercing flesh. Thank God, the knight who threw the javelin had slightly tilted his hand upwards, and it was him who had been thrown. He wasn't the only one hit. Numerous screams of pain echoed from both sides. Officers shouted, "Hold on! Hold on!" fearing the formation would be disrupted. Fortunately, the enemy attack only caused a minor commotion, and thanks to their regular training, the soldiers quickly regained their composure. Previously, Joss hadn't had a clear understanding of the knight's strength. He only knew they were incredibly powerful. After enlisting and undergoing assassination training, he estimated he could at least hold his own against a knight for a few rounds. Now he realized how wrong he was. Judging from the force of that javelin, the knight could probably lift him up like a chicken and throw him. A head-on confrontation would likely result in instant death. Fortunately, he was holding a musket, and his companions were also armed with muskets. Upon hearing the order for the third rank to fire, Joss immediately pulled the trigger. After a series of crackling sounds, the Kent family knight he had aimed at, along with his mount, was covered in blood mist. The knight's head slammed back to the ground, and the horse was dead. The first wave of charging cavalry was either dead or had fled, posing no further threat. The cavalry behind halted their charge, observing the phalanx from a distance. However, the soldiers on the outermost edge of the square, Sergeant Makarov's platoon, still firmly planted their rifle butts on the ground, bayonets pointing diagonally upwards. They hadn't reloaded after firing and remained in this position. If the enemy continued their relentless charge, they would have to use their own flesh and blood and their bayonets to block and slow their advance. Gunfire also rang out from the left side of the square. The Kent cavalry split into two groups, one charging the right side of the square's front, the other charging from the left. After the frontal attackers were hit, the slightly lagging cavalry immediately yanked their reins. Although they didn't know what had happened, the sight of their comrades made what they perceived as the safest decision. But galloping horses don't stop easily. Some had already entered the flintlock musket range. Joyce, in command of the left side of the square, immediately ordered the outer two platoons to open fire simultaneously, sending the vanguard of the cavalry pack sprawling. As the clanging sounds rang out, Jace sensed impending danger. He immediately tried to stop his mount, and in the process, he saw the family knights at the forefront fall from their horses one by one. Fire crossbows. Jace immediately recognized this weapon. It was said that the Glemans had easily wiped out the pirates of the Northwest Bay with this very weapon. Previously, Jace had dismissed this weapon as an exaggeration from commoners, having grown up with military affairs. He had seen all kinds of weapons. He never imagined that this legendary weapon was real, and in such large numbers. With flashes of fire and billowing smoke, deadly projectiles shot out at speeds invisible to the naked eye, claiming lives one after another. That was how the rumors described the weapon, and what he witnessed today was exactly as they described. What a terrifying weapon. He had underestimated the Gleman family. But he wouldn't give up. As a noble scion who had received an elite education from childhood, Jace's first thought when faced with difficulties was how to solve them, not how to escape. Throughout his life, he had encountered many unexpected difficulties, but he had overcome them all with unwavering willpower. He believed he could solve them this time as well. The Arda army consisted only of infantry, putting them at a natural disadvantage against cavalry. Moreover, they had formed a square formation with a hollowed-out center and facing outwards on all four sides. This formation offered little opportunity for movement, and the initiative remained firmly in his hands. Woo woo woo. Having made up his mind, Jace blew his horn, and the cavalrymen roaming around him gathered around him. They moved while maintaining what they considered a safe distance from the Arda army, eventually forming a large contingent of nearly 200 men. Jace led his cavalry at a trot, slowly circling the Arda army's square formation. As he circled, he observed the formation, trying to find its weaknesses. However, he discovered that, combined with the range and power of the fire crossbows, this square formation, facing outwards on all four sides, had virtually no weaknesses. Even with kite-like long-range harassment, they couldn't get too close to the enemy. Before their arrows and javelins could be effective, they would be felled by the fire crossbows. Although the hollow square formation only had 3 or 4 layers of soldiers on the outside, appearing quite thin, Jace could see that the Arda army's formation maximized the firepower density of their fire crossbows without leaving the soldiers feeling isolated. Firepower, yes, this word that suddenly popped into his mind was perfect for the enemy's weapons. If they were arranged in a solid square, the width of each side would be greatly reduced, and the firepower output would be significantly weakened. Those in the middle of the square would be blocked by those in front and be completely ineffective. Damn it! What strategy could he use to break through this damned square formation? The enemy remained motionless, showing no weakness. Most armies would have become restless at the sight of cavalry running around them. Just as he was racking his brains, the Arda army showed signs of movement. Jace was overjoyed. The enemy had finally lost their patience. Come on, come after us. However, the enemy didn't disperse as he expected. They simply opened up the 4 corners of their formation, and some soldiers laboriously pushed out something. Jace's face instantly turned pale. He suddenly remembered something. If the rumored fire crossbow was real, then the other rumored powerful weapon. He raised his whip and lashed it hard against his mount's rump. Scatter. It's a thunder hammer. His words had barely left his lips when a muffled thunderous sound rang out, and something seemed to whistle through the air. Chapter 243 Hollow Square Array 3. Just as Jace's horse reared up, several cannonballs whistled through the air. A 6-pound shell grazed his face. It struck the ground a short distance away, splashing dirt all over his face. Still carrying considerable kinetic energy, the shell bounced back immediately. Nay, a nearby warhorse's left foreleg was severed in two by the rebounding shell, neighing in agony before collapsing to the ground, unable to rise again. Its rider was thrown to the ground, landing face first in the mud. The shells bounced and spun on the ground, practically plowing it, unleashing their destructive power. Cavalry and horses in their path suffered terribly. A mere touch caused a scratch, a glancing blow a muscle, and a direct hit meant certain death. The first round of artillery fire was merely a test. The Alda artillery fired 6 shells at the enemy, only 2 of which hit the target. However, due to the enemy's relatively dense formation, it still resulted in 2 dead and 3 horses, and 4 seriously wounded and 5 horses wounded. Scatter. Scatter. This time, without Jace's reminder, the Kent family's cavalry was thrown into chaos, their previously tight formation breaking apart in a noisy frenzy. Even without the knights urging them on, the frightened warhorses began to scatter on their own. Run. Run faster. To avoid being targeted by the thunderhammer, the cavalrymen spurred their horses on, increasing their speed. Jace, who had almost been summoned by the Heavenly Father, was drenched in a cold sweat. It had been too dangerous, and his right cheek still felt burning. They hadn't run far when several more booms rang out, and the artillery deployed at the other corner of the formation opened fire. This artillery barrage yielded no results, but its immense power chilled the cavalrymen even more. After several artillery bombardments and the deaths of several more men, Jace finally realized the gravity of the situation. He was helpless against the phalanx before him. His men couldn't get close, while the enemy's thunderhammers could relentlessly pursue them. Moreover, the thunderhammer's firing speed, range, and power far surpassed similar weapons like catapults and crossbows. Retreat. Resigned to reality, he decisively gave the order to retreat, leading his knights and squires in a loose formation back the way they came. Alda's thunderhammers relentlessly pursued them until they were out of range. Bryce observed the enemy's retreat through his binoculars. It doesn't seem like a feigned retreat. He ordered the hollow phalanx to disband, the 1st Battalion and the Artillery Company to continue guarding the perimeter, and the 2nd Battalion and the Transport Company to clean up the battlefield. After the orders were given, the battlefield suddenly fell silent. The silence lasted only a few seconds before being shattered by a sudden commotion. Long live, long live! All the officers and soldiers erupted in a frenzy of shouts. We've won! Every face beamed with excitement, their hearts overflowing with pride. The new recruits were no exception, as were the veterans. Although they had all participated in battles to quell pirates and suppress the Barden Rebellion, none had been as perilous as what they had just witnessed. They had just faced nearly 300 knights head-on. They could boast about it for the rest of their lives, passing down their glorious deeds to their descendants. Strictly speaking, nearly half of the Kent family's cavalry were squires, but to the ordinary soldiers, they were no different. As long as they rode magnificent, what they considered magnificent, horses and wore splendid, what they also considered splendid, armor, they were powerful figures to be feared. Now, over 200 once untouchable figures had been driven away in disgrace by them and their comrades, leaving behind many corpses. God's protection is like thunder and lightning. Who doesn't know Lord Gleman and his soldiers? Lord Gleman, my lord hero with a gleaming laurel wreath. Your soldiers are forever the most loyal. As long as you continue to let us sweep away the enemy, we will overturn the whole world for you. The soldiers spontaneously sang the songs they had sung during the march, their enthusiasm growing with each song. Before, singing them had felt a bit like boasting, but after the battle just now, the officers and soldiers were now completely immersed in the music. Bang! A sudden gunshot stopped everyone from continuing their merriment. Deputy Commander Joyce, his face grim, gripped his still smoking pistol in his right hand and said coldly, "If I had turned the muzzle slightly just now, one of you would be dead." Then he gave Bryce a wink. Bryce was taken aback at first, then realized what was happening, and an awkward expression flashed across his face. This guy had just been caught up in the officers' and soldiers' emotions and had joined in the merriment. Ahem, he coughed twice, put on a serious expression, and loudly ordered, "Reconnaissance squad, send men to check if they've really retreated." As soon as he finished speaking, Several riders emerged from the formation and sped off in the direction the Kent family cavalry had retreated. Bryce said to the men in a deep voice, "I understand your excitement right now, but we are on the battlefield, and vigilance must be our top priority. This situation must never happen again. Execute my orders immediately." "Yes, sir," everyone composed themselves and responded in unison. The 1st Infantry Battalion and Artillery Company continued their vigilance, while the 2nd Infantry Battalion and Transport Company dispersed in squads to search and clear the battlefield. "Look! This horse is tall and strong. Perfect for pulling cannons. This armor looks valuable. It's shiny, oh, and a bag of money. I must remind you, all spoils belong to the generals." The battlefield was filled with laughter and cheers. Although they had been intimidated by Major Joyce earlier, the joy of victory had not diminished in the slightest. Many Kent family cavalrymen were taken prisoner by the Arda army. Some were wounded and unable to move, while others had lost their mounts and, after fleeing on foot, were caught and brought back. The Arda soldiers gathered the prisoners who could still walk and shouted, "All of you, stand in a line." One prisoner, a knight, began to put on airs. "I must remind you, you lowly commoner. I am a noble knight. Ouch! You dare hit me, get lost. Even in this state, you still dare to act high and mighty. I protest. You cannot treat a knight like this. Get your commander here, protest my foot. One more word and you'll be shot." Seeing the crossbows held by the soldiers, the prisoners became obedient. While the Arda army was busy, dust rose again on the northern road, and the soldiers cleaning up the battlefield immediately became alert. "It's that Heller family cavalry from earlier," an officer holding binoculars recognized them. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 244 Reunion. After bypassing the Arda army's phalanx, Derek led his family knights to a stop a short distance away. They planned to rest briefly before returning to their allies' phalanx to reinforce them. Although the Arda army's banners were neatly arranged and they appeared well trained, they were ultimately infantry, too vulnerable against fast-moving cavalry. Derek couldn't bring himself to abandon his allies and run away. Before they could even catch their breath, a heart-wrenching scene unfolded. 2 Kent cavalry units, one on each side, charged fiercely towards the Arda army. As many began to pray for their allies, something astonishing happened. A series of popping sounds rang out, followed by a thick cloud of smoke, and a large number of Kent cavalrymen instantly fell. It was incredible. The cavalrymen hadn't even thrown their javelins before being struck by something and falling from their horses. Clearly, this unseen force could inflict fatal damage, as most of those who fell couldn't get up. Only a few lucky ones managed to throw javelins, inflicting some casualties on the Arda army, but the entire phalanx remained unshaken. Derek and his knights watched in stunned silence as another Kent cavalry attack was easily thwarted by their own forces, resulting in a stalemate. It wasn't until the cannons roared like thunder that they were jolted from their daze. "Quick!" rejoined the Arda. Derek spurred his horse and led his knights toward the phalanx. "Friends from Arda, I am Viscount Derek Heller, son of Earl Winifred Heller. May I ask who your highest-ranking officer is here?" Hearing Derek announce his name, Bryce straightened his collar, puffed out his chest, and loudly replied, "I am Lieutenant Colonel Bryce Alder, commander of the 1st Infantry Battalion of Arda, leading this army in the name of Earl Griles." Derek dismounted and strode toward Bryce, the soldiers parting to make way for him. Their hands clasped tightly. "Alder. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you for rescuing us from the Kent family. On behalf of the Heller family, I extend my respects to the Gleman family, as well as to you and your men. It is only natural for allies to help. On behalf of Earl Gleman, I also extend my respects to the Heller family." After some pleasantries, Derek, who had served as Alder's military commander during Old Gleman's time, knew that Bryce was merely a wild knight. Normally, Derek, as the son of an earl, would be blunt with such commoners, but having been saved, he found himself unconsciously becoming polite. "The weapons you used to defeat the cavalry, were they the legendary fire crossbows and thunder hammers?" Despite his efforts to restrain himself, Derek couldn't help but ask. Such powerful weapons would surely be considered important military secrets, and he had been hesitant to ask, fearing he might offend the other party. Fire crossbows? Thunder hammers? The names are quite descriptive. Indeed, Viscount Heller, It was precisely with these that we defeated the Kent family cavalry. Derek further inquired, may I touch them? Bryce understood Derek's thoughts at this moment, but still wore a hesitant expression. Firearms were the Arda army's greatest asset. I apologize, I shouldn't have been so abrupt. Gentlemen, I will lead the way to the encampment. Derek quickly changed the subject. Thank you for your trouble. Bryce ordered the troops to regroup and resume their journey. The speed at which the Arda army assembled once again surprised Derek and his knights. They sounded their bugles, and everyone quickly found their positions as if they had rehearsed many times beforehand. In less than 20 minutes, a neat marching column was formed. As Bryce and his men followed Derek closer to the encampment, the armies of other lords in the allied forces had just finished fighting the Kent family army. The two sides had engaged in a chaotic battle, and neither side had gained an advantage. What a blunder today, the officers complained to each other, and the morale of the troops plummeted. The two groups met halfway through the journey. Derek, you're still alive. I thought, Earl Malkin exclaimed upon seeing Derek. Thank God, otherwise how would we explain this to your father? Though his words were tinged with relief, his tone was full of sarcasm. I broke through and retreated north, Derek said with a look of shame. I'm sorry for causing everyone trouble. Earl Parker rode up and said, we'll discuss today's events properly when we get back. And this gentleman is, he had already recognized the Griles family banners and turned to ask Bryce, who was leading the group. Bryce stepped forward and saluted. Bryce Alder, I have come to join you all on the orders of Earl Gleman. You must be Earl Price Kent? Please give my master his regards. Yes, I am Price Parker. You have come at the right time. Our great battle with the Kent family is imminent, and we need a fresh force like yours. Earl Parker, seeing the disciplined ranks of this army from Alder, which did not resemble ragtag troops at all, was secretly pleased that Ragleman's decision to join them was indeed correct. The two armies then returned together to the village where they were to be stationed. Upon arriving at the village, Bryce discovered that it had once been a village, but now it was deserted. The villagers had all taken refuge in the Lord's castle before the arrival of the Allied forces. Looking west from the village, a castle came into view. This was Beethoven Castle. Although not large, it was perched atop a high cliff, with only a narrow road leading to its east. Its treacherous terrain explained why the Allied forces had been unable to conquer it. However, the castle's exit was also firmly blocked by the Allied forces. Although the village was not small, the Allied forces numbered 6,000 or 7,000. The houses had already been allocated to the earlier arriving troops, leaving the Alda army to camp in an open area north of the village. Bryce ordered the two deputy battalion commanders to direct the soldiers in setting up camp and preparing food. They hadn't even had lunch before a fierce battle with the Kent family. During the battle, everyone was highly tense and temporarily forgot about hunger, but after the battle, their stomachs were even hungrier than before. He and Joyce were invited to a military conference to discuss future battle plans. They quickly ate a few biscuits and headed to the largest house in the center of the village, which had originally been the village chief's house but was now being used as a meeting room by the Allied forces. Welcome, gentlemen from Alda. Derek's voice greeted them as they entered. Sorry for the 2-day hiatus, I've been quite busy, especially with 2 projects recently, and I was called in to work overtime today. I assure all readers again, this book will absolutely not be abandoned. Chapter 245 The Battle of Batalo 1. After Bryce and Joyce entered the meeting room, Derek rose to welcome them and invited them to sit beside him. Several people frowned, as these two were neither nobles nor knights, and having them sit with them was beneath their dignity. Many felt they should have been standing. What was even more infuriating was that these two showed no courtesy whatsoever, simply plopping down as if it were their right. Really, didn't they know their place? What had Griles taught them? Price Parker, however, seemed unconcerned. He cleared his throat and said, Gentlemen, the last remaining force has arrived. Let's discuss how to deal with the Kent family. But then Viscount Johnston frowned and said, Your Excellency, shouldn't we first establish some rules? This situation is not beneficial to anyone. As soon as the Viscount finished speaking, a chorus of agreement arose. Those who had come to participate were not only the earls, but also minor lords like viscounts and barons. Before Count Parker could say anything, Derek Heller stood up, his face flushed. Gentlemen, today's battle was caused by my recklessness, and I sincerely apologize. It's good that you realize that, Count Parker said calmly, stroking his beard. Derek, our alliance is a unified whole. In the future, you must consult with everyone before acting, and obtain the support of the majority. Yes, Uncle Parker, I will remember your words. Seeing Derek soften his stance, Price Parker was relieved. He had feared that the young man's arrogance would lead to a confrontation and escalate the situation. The Heller family's influence was indispensable in this opposition to Maltz Kent. He had also resented Derek's unauthorized actions, but fearing it would provoke a rebellious attitude, he had intended to avoid the topic at the meeting and speak with him privately afterward. However, someone had brought it up anyway, and fortunately, Derek had admitted his mistake. This was truly the best outcome. Earl Parker abruptly changed the subject. So, how did you break through? Derek replied, speaking of which, I have to thank the Arda army that arrived today. They were the ones who repelled the Kent family's pursuers. Upon hearing this, everyone present doubted their ears. Derek returned with a troop of over 100 knights. Surely the Kent family's pursuers outnumbered them? The pursuers that even the Heller family's knights couldn't hold off were dealt with by those Ardas? Derek stood up and bowed first to Bryce and Joyce, making them somewhat flustered and quickly rise. A high-ranking nobleman bowing to them was something they had never imagined in their lives. Then Derek recounted the battle in detail. The more they listened, the more unbelievable it seemed. Fire crossbows, thunder hammers, weapons like these really existed? And the power was just as legendary. But they still chose to believe him, even if they had been saved by the Ardas. Derek had no reason to boast about them. Incredible. Can we see these weapons? Earl Parker asked, his eyes wide, echoing the sentiments of most. Bryce and Joyce exchanged a glance, and the commander of the 1st Infantry Battalion stood up, saying, of course, gentlemen, but we need to find an open space first. Since it was a coordinated operation, there was no need to be too secretive. Letting allies understand the effectiveness of their weapons was essential, otherwise, how could they fight together? In the open area north of the Allied forces' camp, gunfire deafened the air, artillery roared, and acrid smoke filled the air. Bryce arranged for a company of infantry and an artillery crew to demonstrate the legendary fire crossbow and thunder hammer to the Allied generals. A row of human-shaped targets for soldiers to practice swordsmanship was riddled with bullets. Divine weapons. Divine weapons, the people present exclaimed repeatedly, not to mention their immense power. The sheer scale of the weapon was enough to scare away a large number of people. Derek watched intently. Although he had witnessed the Alda army's battles before, it was from a distance. Now, seeing it up close, the feeling was completely different. Seeing everyone's reaction, Bryce shrugged at Joyce. Now, besides porcelain and canned goods, there was another Alda item that someone else was eyeing. However, they were fearless. Their standing army of over 2,000 men, plus several thousand militiamen trained in basic military skills, gave them confidence. Want it? Come and take it if you dare. Sure enough, many people immediately expressed their willingness to buy. I'm sorry, gentlemen, this is not something we can decide. If you really want to buy, please go to Lockhart and find Earl Griles. Bryce shook his head, passing the trouble to Paul. In fact, Lockhart had discussed the issue of whether to sell firearms to the public many times before. After all, selling weapons was an extremely profitable industry, and selling firearms was something only they did in the world. Given the current simple structure of firearms and cannons, it would be easy for others to copy them once they acquire them. It's better to make a fortune before others succeed, establish a reputation for original, reliable quality based on technological advantage, and then invest the profits in research and development of new technologies. This cycle repeats, ensuring a perpetual technological lead and staying ahead of the competition. To mitigate the threat posed by external acquisition of firearms, the only relatively easy thing to control is the gunpowder formula. Firearms and cannons without gunpowder are just piles of scrap metal. There was a magical weapon in ancient times called hellfire, which was lost because of its excellent secrecy. Discussions in Lakeside Town regarding the sale of firearms always conclude with selling firearms at an appropriate time after establishing absolute military superiority in the Northwest Bay, but this appropriate time is always delayed. However, before that appropriate time arrives, it's best to whet the appetites of potential customers. Unable to purchase one, Derek anxiously asked, "Can I try out the fire crossbow myself?" "Of course, Master Heller, you can use this short one. Actually, we call them muskets, and the big one is called a cannon." Bryce generously drew his pistol, loaded it, and handed it to him. "Ha! Thank you." Derek took the musket, his face beaming with excitement. like a child who had just received a new toy. Oh. Be very careful, don't point it at your own people. Hearing Bryce's warning, the surrounding people gasped and scattered, quickly moving away from Derek. They then remembered that the thing Master Heller held could be deadly. Don't worry, don't worry. Following Bryce's instructions, Derek pointed his pistol at the human-shaped target in front of him and pulled the trigger. Bang! The gunshot rang out, and the human-shaped target in front of him was blasted into pieces. That's the feeling. That's the feeling, Derek exclaimed happily, fondling the pistol as he savored the strange, slightly tingling sensation in his hand. I want to try it too, let me try it first. The onlookers crowded around, eagerly making their requests. Chapter 246 The Battle of Bitau Castle 2. Chapter 243 The Battle of Bitauberg 2. After the initial excitement of playing with firearms subsided, everyone remembered they had serious business to discuss and returned to the meeting room. What's there to discuss? Our men are all here, let's fight. Yes. Send someone to deliver a challenge right now. Let's see if that Kent kid has any guts. The sooner we finish this, the sooner we can go home and farm. But judging from today's situation, it seems they've received reinforcements. Many advocated for immediate battle, while others insisted on caution. Just as everyone was arguing and undecided, a guard entered the meeting room. My lords, the Kent family has sent an envoy, Earl Parker ordered. Let him in, let's hear what they have to say. The guard obeyed and went out, returning shortly with a man who, judging from his attire, appeared to be a low-ranking nobleman. The newcomer first announced his name, then began his business. I am here on the orders of Viscount Jace Kent to advise you all to surrender as soon as possible. Before the messenger could finish, a burly knight sprang to his feet and cursed. That spineless coward Jace, did he send you here just to spout nonsense? The knight's words amused everyone, and the entire room erupted in laughter. Although his words were extremely rude, no one reprimanded him. Only the messenger's expression remained unchanged. He seemed to have anticipated this outcome. The envoy feigned regret, shaking his head as he said, "That's truly a pity. How many innocent lives will be lost?" The knight from before said impatiently, "Stop beating around the bush, get to the point, HMPH, what an impudent fellow." Muttering under his breath, the envoy cleared his throat and said, "My other mission is to convey Lord Kent's proposal, that neither side resort to trickery or intrigue, but instead find a time to set up their formations in the middle of our standoff and fight a fair fight. I wonder if any of you dare to do that." "Why wouldn't we dare? You're underestimating us. We should be the ones saying that to you." The allied generals, filled with righteous indignation, slammed their fists on the table and shouted. The envoy's lips curled into a barely perceptible smile as he continued, "In that case, we propose we postpone the battle for 2 days. After all, today's fierce fighting has left both sides needing rest. 2 days later, we'll each be at our best." However, he abruptly changed the subject. "This is merely our proposal. If you wish to choose another date, we will agree. 3 days, 4 days, even tomorrow or the day after, we are ready at any time." A murmur of discussion arose in the room. Finally, Earl Parker summarized everyone's opinions and said to the envoy, "Very well, then we'll fight in 2 days. This is to give you time to write your wills. If you wish to come and die early, we agree to that as well." The envoy bowed to him and said, "Since you have agreed, I will take my leave. Oh, by the way, I wonder if we could exchange our prisoners now." Earl Parker waved his hand. "Let's discuss that after we've determined the victor. Gentlemen, see you in 2 days. By then, one of us will be the prisoner of the other." The envoy bowed again and left the room. Derek, deep in thought, addressed the group. "I have a feeling that Jace is stalling for time. If we lead our troops now, with the help of crossbows, I mean muskets, and cannons, we can definitely achieve great results." "Shut up, Derek. Think about the stupid things you did today. Have you already forgotten the pain before your wounds have even healed? You?" Earl Malkin's words made Derek's face flush red, but the events of the day left him without the confidence to retort. "The envoy just said that if we choose to fight tomorrow, they are ready to fight at any time. Is this stalling for time? Besides, since the battle time has already been agreed upon, a surprise attack beforehand would damage our reputation." The others disagreed with Derek's suggestion. Seeing the atmosphere in the meeting becoming somewhat tense, Earl Parker spoke up. "All right, it's almost dark now, and it's obviously not time for battle. Furthermore, our respective troops need time to integrate. Let's face the Kent family in 2 days." Earl Parker, as the initiator of the alliance, made a decision, and Eric had nothing more to say. The business discussion was adjourned, and servants brought out platters of food and barrels of fine wine, allowing the Allied generals to begin their dinner. "Oh, right. Lieutenant Colonel Alder, am I calling you that correctly?" Earl Parker asked Bryce, cutting his steak. "Yes, Lord Parker," Bryce replied quickly, reluctantly setting down his knife and fork. "There's something I need to arrange with you. Bring the map." A servant trotted over and spread a map on the table. "Come and take a look, Lieutenant Colonel Alder." Bryce rose and went to the Earl's side, looking at the map. The Earl pointed to a region on the map and said, "If your men are lacking anything, go to these 3 adjacent villages for supplies." Bryce understood. "Thank you for considering this, Your Excellency," the Earl laughed heartily. "You're welcome." Viscount Johnston, sitting not far away, raised his glass to Bryce. "Hey, Mr. Griles, don't stand on ceremony with the villagers here, they're all very hospitable." Bryce smiled back at him, knowing what the so-called supplies meant. Following his lord's orders, the Arda army was to maintain good relations with the local residents, and any necessary supplies should be transported from the territory by the transport company. However, in extreme circumstances, Bryce wouldn't mind taking some measures. Viscount Johnston refilled his glass and raised it high. A toast to the hospitable people of Bitauberg. Cheers! Everyone raised their glasses and shouted in unison. Being on the battlefield, vigilance was paramount, so no one drank much, and they dispersed after the meal. "I must remind you all to keep your soldiers in check, and focus on preparations for battle these next few days. Don't let them spend their days drinking and chasing after prostitutes. Also, beware of spies," Earl Parker warned before leaving. Military camps in this era contained more than just generals and soldiers. Merchants selling supplies, prostitutes, and even the families of officers and soldiers, all sorts of people were present. So, during breaks from training, the soldiers easily found ways to amuse themselves, having a drink in a makeshift tent tavern, chatting with women in a caravan brothel. These were things they enjoyed doing on a daily basis. Naturally, in this mixed environment, military intelligence was easily leaked. Although everyone was extremely wary of spies, no one ever thought of changing the situation. Perhaps the world perceived military camps as inherently like this. Chapter 247 The Battle of Bitau Castle 3. Bryce and Joyce toured the entire encampment and, upon returning to their own camp, immediately issued 2 orders. First, no one was allowed to enter or leave the Alda Army's camp without permission. Second, no officers or soldiers were allowed to participate in any recreational activities within the encampment. These orders were relayed to the entire army that evening, effectively dampening the enthusiasm of those eager to engage in any activities. Nothing more was said that night. The next day, the Allied forces assembled, and the troops from different territories familiarized themselves with each other, coordinating communication methods such as flag signals and bugle calls to avoid the chaos of the previous battle. Presumably, the Kent family's army on the other side was doing the same. To avoid frightening their own men, the Alda army conducted another test firing of muskets and cannons in front of all their allies, and the encampment was once again filled with a deafening roar of gunfire. The commotion caused by the officer's observation yesterday had already piqued the soldiers' curiosity. The entire garrison was abuzz with talk of the seemingly out-of-the-sky sound, with some guessing it was the legendary fire crossbow and thunder hammer, both originating from the territory of Arda, and coincidentally, Arda troops had arrived yesterday. Today's demonstration was an eye-opener for the lower-ranking officers and soldiers. Seeing an army wielding such powerful weapons, which turned out to be their own ally, boosted morale across the entire force. The senior officers, on the other hand, marveled at the discipline of the Arda army. In their eyes, the army followed orders with absolute obedience, their uniformity further reinforcing this impression. "If only I had an army like that under my command," every senior officer shared this thought. The drills continued until after 3 p.m. Given the physical condition of ordinary soldiers in other armies, further training would have been exhausting, so they were dismissed and returned to their respective camps. Just as Bryce sat down, a guard reported that 3 men claiming to be from a nearby village wanted to see him. He followed the guards into a tent, where, sure enough, 3 people were waiting. Upon seeing someone enter, they immediately rose and saluted Bryce. Bryce gestured for them to sit, and the 3 representatives sat down tremblingly. He asked with a smile, "What are your names, representatives? What brings you here?" Bryce always remembered his lord's teachings to be as kind as possible to ordinary people. The representatives exchanged glances, and finally, the one in the middle spoke. He first introduced himself, stating his identity. They were from the 3 villages designated as the Arda Army's supply district, and they had come as representatives to negotiate the Arda Army's supply issue with Bryce, the supreme commander. This morning, a quartermaster had led his men to their respective villages to collect supplies for the last time. They didn't need to know which lord's quartermaster it was, knowing wouldn't matter. They just needed to obediently hand over the supplies. As the quartermaster left, he tossed out a parting remark, "From now on, you'll be under the control of the Arda." Hearing that another new army was coming, the villagers were devastated. These villages, far from their lord, hadn't had time to escape to the castle when the allied forces attacked. Even if they had had enough time, the castle couldn't hold too many people, leaving these unfortunate subjects to be slaughtered at their homes. The 3 villages, already thoroughly exploited, immediately sent representatives to the encampment to investigate. They had no choice. If they were plundered any further, they truly wouldn't survive. Sir, seeing that Bryce seemed quite approachable, the representatives became less reserved. "Excuse me, how much food do you need?" "Food, yes, our 3 villages can scrape together some." "Please take a look." The middle representative handed over a piece of paper detailing the amount of supplies they could hand over to Arda. Even the countryside was starting to use paper. This was truly a good sign. Bryce sighed, glanced at the numbers on the document, and then fell silent. Seeing Bryce's silence, the representatives panicked, thinking he was dissatisfied with the figures. "My lord, for God's sake, please let us go. We really can't offer any more." Several waves of troops have already come to the village, they pleaded incessantly. Bryce quickly waved his hand, saying, "What are you thinking?" He continued solemnly, "Now let me tell you, when you go back, tell your neighbors, the Arda army will not come to your village to collect any supplies, at least not at this stage." Bryce hadn't completely ruled out the possibility. As soon as he finished speaking, the 3 representatives exchanged bewildered glances. An army that didn't collect supplies from villages near their base was truly rare, no, unheard of. "Please forgive our ears, but, what did you just say?" I said, "We will not come to your village to collect supplies at this stage." Bryce repeated his words, ensuring the 3 representatives heard him clearly. This is truly incredible." "Oh no, I mean, thank you so much." The representatives, realizing what was happening, bowed repeatedly to Bryce. "All right. Let me add something else. If we truly lack something, and you happen to have it, we'll buy it with money. We hope you can offer a fair price." "Wow, money?" The representatives swore they would never deceive the Arda army. Bryce continued, "I was actually considering something else just now. Please listen carefully and take my words back to the village." The representatives perked up their ears. "The location of Fort Bito is very important. We and the enemy will likely fight repeatedly for it. If you can't make it here, you can relocate to Arda. You're sure to find a satisfactory job there." "Arda? Recent news says it's indeed developing well there. Perhaps relocating there is a good option?" The representatives kept Bryce's words in mind. "Rest assured, General, we will certainly convey your message. Also, I'd like to hire the able-bodied men from your village. Remember, it's hire, I'll pay them." Hearing that it wasn't forced conscription and that there was money to be made, the representatives' eyes lit up. This would be a good way for the villagers to supplement their income. Recently, every household had been nearly bankrupted by the various armies. Bryce's purpose in recruiting the villagers was simple. Once the war began, the villagers would carry stretchers to transport fallen soldiers to the rear. Of course, they didn't need to walk in front of the army, they could follow at a distance. And if the Alda army suffered setbacks, they could simply run away without being held responsible. "I have to work overtime both weekend days, and I'll be on a business trip to Jiangsu for a week next week, so I might not be able to update many chapters next week. Please forgive me." Chapter 248 The Battle of Bitao Castle 4. Chapter 245 The Battle of Bitoberg 4 On April 2, 1991, Sacred Calendar, the battle for Bitoberg between the 2 major factions in the Northwest Bay officially began. The sun had just risen when the Allied camp was engulfed in a cacophony of noise. The officers' roll calls, shouts, the crack of whips, the movement of men and horses, and the clash of weapons and armor filled the entire camp with a tense and deadly atmosphere. It took the Allied forces over 2 hours to complete their formation. Price Parker and other generals stood on horseback at the front of the entire formation. The old Earl, facing the rising sun, drew his sword and pointed it diagonally to the sky. The sword gleamed in the sunlight. He shouted solemnly, "Target! Kent camp! Advance, roar!" The soldiers roared in unison. The square formations of the Allied forces began to slowly move, advancing towards the enemy camp to the east. For this battle, the Allied forces left a little over 1,000 men to guard Biro Castle behind them, committing the remaining 6,000 or so to the fighting. The two camps were quite far apart, and to prevent their painstakingly arranged formations from crumbling, the Allied forces had to march and stop frequently, regrouping every so often. After all, the soldiers' skill level was generally low. Most were newly conscripted militia, who had been tilling the fields just moments before. This situation reminded Bryce of the first military parade held by Earl Giles upon his ascension to the throne. The Arda army then was like the armies of various commanderies marching now. No matter how perfectly orderly their formations were at the beginning, they would inevitably fall apart after a few steps. The scouts who had gone to scout ahead returned with a report. "The Kent army is also moving this way in orderly formation. The two armies will soon make contact." Earl Parker raised his telescope and looked eastward. This was a gift from Bryce, given to him at Paul's behest. The old Earl treasured this powerful tool, capable of observing enemies from afar, and carried it with him at all times. Other lords and generals were envious and privately offered Bryce large sums to buy it, but Bryce refused them all with the same reasoning he used for firearms. Through the telescope, dust was rising in the east, indicating a large army was approaching. Bryce rode up to Plath Parker and said, "Your Excellency, our army faces the sun, while the enemy's back is to the sun. The situation is unfavorable for us." Earl Parker nodded and asked, "Does Lieutenant Colonel Alder have any strategy?" Bryce raised his whip and pointed east-northeast. "If we can seize that high slope first, we can use its terrain advantage to some extent to offset the disadvantage of poor sunlight, and the higher ground will also be more effective for our artillery." Although the Grumman Military Academy, under the tutelage of the old Knight Schroeder, had crammed a group of officers into training, some basic military common sense had been firmly imprinted in the minds of officers at all levels of the Alda army. Bryce was particularly sensitive to terrain, and before the battle, he had scouts thoroughly survey the surrounding area. Earl Parker stroked his beard and said hesitantly, "The idea is good, but if we suddenly speed up, I'm afraid, no need to trouble your men, sirs. The Alda army is willing to be the vanguard and seize the high ground ahead for the main force." Earl Parker pondered for a moment. "Very well, then I'll leave it to Lieutenant Colonel Ald." Bryce gave him a salute that felt slightly unfamiliar to everyone, then rode back to the front of his troops. 1st Infantry Battalion, 2nd Infantry Battalion, Artillery Company, all units, target the high ground to the northeast, advance at full speed. The Alda army quickly sprang into action, breaking away from the main Allied force on foot. Each artillery piece in the artillery company was pulled by at least 4 horses, making them highly mobile and closely following the 2 infantry battalions. Although advancing at full speed, the Alda army maintained a fairly disciplined formation. If they encountered the enemy, they could stop briefly to regroup and immediately be ready for battle. Such high quality impressed the other Allied lords. It seems the rumors about Gleman maintaining a standing army are true. Under Earl Parker's urging, the main Allied force also slightly increased its pace towards the high ground to the northeast. The 1st Battalion was the first to approach the high ground and discovered figures already there. The officers of the vanguard company judged the figures to be Kent scouts and immediately led their soldiers to charge and fire several volleys. After several lives were taken by the unfamiliar weapons, the remaining figures hastily retreated from the high ground. The 2 battalions of soldiers, panting, climbed halfway up the hill and rearranged their line formation. "Quick! Get the artillery battery up and bombard the advancing Kent army," Bryce urged anxiously. Through his binoculars, he noticed the Kent army's march had shifted slightly north, clearly heading towards the hill. Their advance had to be slowed. At this critical moment, the artillery, true to their rigorous training, quickly constructed firing positions on the hilltop. With a roar and thick smoke, 14 solid shot, carrying immense kinetic energy, flew towards the advancing Kent army. The artillery battery was now equipped with 6 6-pounder cannons and 8 4-pounder cannons, all fitted with flintlock ignition systems, greatly improving firing efficiency. In this shelling, the artillery company experimented with large artillery barrage tactics for the first time, using all available artillery to concentrate bombardment on a main target or the enemy's advancing route. Since direct hits were difficult, they opted for indiscriminate bombardment of a key point to compensate for the lack of precision. Fortunately, despite the distance, several shells still landed on the heads of the Kent family's army. Maintain formation. Anyone who disobeys orders will be executed on the spot, Jace shouted hysterically, his orders echoing throughout the area. Jace's original plan was indeed to seize the high ground, but the Allied forces had beaten him to it. Enraged, he ordered a faster advance to recapture the high ground. Scouts reported that the number of Allied troops reaching the high ground was not large. Unexpectedly, his army had only advanced a few steps when they heard a distant booming sound. The sound was so familiar that Jace felt a sense of foreboding. Sure enough, something shot through the air and struck the advancing infantry formation. A soldier clutched his severed limb, howling in agony. He was the first wounded. Shells bounced off the ground, continuing to reap lives. Chaos and screams filled the air. Seeing their comrades suffer such a terrible attack, the other formations halted their advance. A strange atmosphere permeated the armies of the lords loyal to the Kent family. Chapter 249 The Battle of Bitau Castle 5 Lines of Execution. Chapter 246 The Battle of Bitauberg 5 Execution in line. The 14 cannons of the artillery company bombarded the enemy troops marching in dense formation continuously, only stopping to cool them down when the barrels became too hot to handle. The Kent army was initially thrown into disarray, with soldiers constantly ignoring warnings from their superiors and fleeing. A cavalry detachment pursued them relentlessly, using the heads of over a dozen deserters to finally stabilize the situation. This won't do, Jace frowned deeply. Although the entire army had been informed the day before that the enemy possessed the legendary Thunderhammer, and the officers and soldiers had been warned to prepare themselves, most were still terrified after experiencing its power firsthand. In fact, the casualties caused by artillery at this distance were not significant, it was mainly the sheer power that was terrifying. Can our ballistae reach them, sir? I'm sorry, the officer in charge of long-range weapons helplessly shrugged. Keep advancing, Jace waved his hand impatiently, but he believed that with their numerical and equipment advantage, victory was assured once they reached the enemy. The 1,000 Artis soldiers, though troublesome, were too few to be decisive. The Kent army, regaining its composure, continued advancing, this time with a much looser formation to avoid long-range artillery fire. However, they could no longer retake the high ground. Count Parker, having observed the Kent army's disarray through his binoculars, seized the opportunity and ordered a full-scale march. By the time the Kent army regrouped, the Allied forces had already formed ranks on the slope. If their disarray persisted, the Allied forces would have the chance to overtake them. Are those Artis on the left flank? Jace carefully observed the enemy's formation and adjusted his troop deployment accordingly. The Allied forces also observed the enemy from afar. They have a lot of archers, at least 1,500. They've moved to the right flank. The Allied commanders discovered a new situation, one they hadn't detected before. A possibility began to surface. Could the enemy's earlier suggestion of engaging in battle 2 days later have been a prelude to these archers? Was Derek's guess correct? The Kent army, with infantry and archers, numbered over 8,000, divided into 4 squares. 3 squares were in the front line, with the last square as a reserve, and a cavalry force of over 500 men on the left flank. The Allied forces numbered nearly 7,000, also divided into 4 squares, deployed almost identically to the Kent army, but with a cavalry force of nearly 400 men on the right flank, facing off against the Kent cavalry on the left. When the Kent army was about 400 meters from the Allied forces, Earl Parker looked around at his men, bowed, and said, "I entrust the rest to you all. Take care, Your Excellency." The commanders returned the bow and rode back to their respective units. Bryce returned to his army. The Alda army was positioned on the left flank of the Allied forces, facing the Kent archers who had adjusted their deployment. Earl Parker ordered the horns to be sounded, and the various square formations of the Allied forces marched towards the Kent army. The first to engage were the cavalry. Although the Kent cavalry had more men, the artillery battery focused its fire on them. Under the barrage, the Kent cavalry could not form a dense charge formation and were forced to charge the Allied forces in a loose formation. The Allied forces, on the other hand, had no such concerns. They charged into dense formation. As soon as the cavalry clashed, every Kent cavalryman who came into contact with the enemy was simultaneously hit by several lances. If he could dodge one, He couldn't dodge another and was stabbed off his horse. In the very first contact, the Allied cavalry inflicted heavy casualties on the Kent cavalry. However, the Kent cavalry had a numerical advantage, and once the two sides clashed, the Allied forces' formation advantage disappeared. From the Allied forces' perspective, the infantry formations of both sides faced each other from right to left. However, the infantry on both sides generally charged forward with a shout when they were about 200 meters away, as if prearranged. Once the fighting broke out, it became chaotic, and the previously orderly formations vanished. The Alda army was the only exception. They advanced slowly and deliberately, step by step to the beat of the drums. Behind them followed the Heller family infantry, who, after Derek's force was wiped out 2 days earlier, had regrouped and were now less than 1,000 strong. Since the Alda army didn't charge, they didn't either, knowing they were being held back. Facing the Alda army were Kent archers, seemingly drawn to the right flank specifically to counter the musketeers. As the Alda army advanced, volleys of arrows rained down upon them, and soldiers fell one after another, but those behind stepped over their fallen comrades and continued forward, their eyes always fixed on the front. As the infantry passed a certain spot, stretchers immediately came running to carry the wounded arrow-struck to the rear, where medics treated their wounds. These men were laborers recruited by Bryce. Many were daring enough to venture into battle to earn a living. The Portree infantry following behind were awestruck by their comrades' resolve. The dejection of their defeat 2 days prior vanished, replaced by an inexplicable feeling. Previously, they had wondered why the Ardis beat drums in battle. Now, their steps unconsciously followed the drumbeats, and their initial formation miraculously remained intact. It wasn't that the Portree infantry were particularly skilled, rather, the enemy arrows were primarily targeting the Arda infantry at the front, with few hitting them. If they were in the lead, they would have already charged forward like the other troops. The officer commanding the Kent archers was puzzled. The distance was close enough, why weren't the Ardis firing their crossbows? According to those who had handled the fire crossbows, this weapon could hide a person at about 100 meters. Lord Jace ordered the archers to engage the Ardis in a firefight, keeping them occupied and preventing them from supporting other units. However, the Ardis continued their advance, letting arrows rain down on their heads without any intention of retaliating. As the distance closed, the Kent army noticed what the enemy was carrying. The gleaming bayonet attached to the fire crossbow caught their attention. Did the Ardis intend to engage in hand-to-hand combat? But their fire crossbows were too short, and although the archers were generally only equipped with daggers, they had a line of pikemen protecting them. With this question in mind, the officer ordered the archers to fire twice more, inflicting considerable casualties on the enemy. Finally, when the distance was about 50 meters, the Ardis stopped. Traveling on a business trip, typing on a phone is so difficult. Chapter 250 The Battle of Bitau Castle 6 Lines of Execution. Advance, alternating fire, ready, Bryce shouted, riding alongside his officers and soldiers. Many Allied generals fought alongside their troops, not because they were particularly brave, but because they feared their soldiers would scatter if they weren't present. With a clatter, the 1,000-strong Alda army formed 3 neat ranks. Upon hearing Bryce's command, the first rank immediately leveled their rifles, pointing them at the Kent troops in front. At this distance, the Alda soldiers could clearly see the faces of their opponents. Bryce raised his hand and swung it down sharply. Fire. From the Kent soldiers' perspective, they saw a sudden burst of smoke, followed by strange explosions and the whooshing sound of something rubbing against the air. Many were then doomed. Especially the spearmen in the first rank protecting the archers. Seeing the Arden stop, they deduced they were about to fire fireballs, and relying on their past experience with bows and arrows, they frantically swung their spears, hoping to deflect any arrows that might be flying through the air. However, this tactic was utterly ineffective against the deadly metal projectiles hurtling towards them. When the first volley of gunfire rang out, the spearmen standing in front of the archers fell almost in unison. Only a few remained, stunned, continuing to swing their spears, still reeling from the shock. The Arda soldiers, equipped with flintlock muskets, were positioned very closely, and at 50 meters, the smooth bore barrels ensured a certain level of accuracy. Moreover, the opposing spearmen were also positioned very tightly, meaning even if bullets missed their targets, they would still hit those nearby. Painful groans quickly filled the entire right flank of the Kent army. Soldiers lying on the ground writhed and struggled, while many moved slightly before falling lifeless. Fire! Fire quickly! suppress the Alda from a distance. The officers on the right flank of the Kent army remained calm and immediately urged their archers to counterattack. While the enemy was thrown into disarray, the first rank of the Alda army remained in place to reload. The next two ranks moved past their comrades, and then a new first rank prepared to fire. They were hit by another volley of arrows, but this time it was much sparser, and the casualties were not great. Bryce gave the order, fire. Gunfire erupted once again on the battlefield. This time, the Kent archers were the unlucky ones. After many fell, they were terrified. Many archers began to retreat, hiding behind others, anything to avoid being in the front. They had realized that the fire crossbows, as ranged weapons, did not fire in a curved trajectory, but rather in a near straight line, so whoever was in the first rank was more likely to be killed. Thus, the right flank of the Kent army began to slowly move backward. However, in terms of the overall situation on the battlefield, the Allied forces were in a precarious position. The Kent army had more cavalry, a larger total number, and a higher armor coverage rate. The scales of victory were gradually tipping in their favor. Seeing the unfavorable situation, Earl Parker ordered all his skilled generals to personally engage in battle. Despite his advanced age, he led his personal guard cavalry in a series of charges. The general's participation boosted the morale of the lower-ranking soldiers, though it was uncertain how long this would last. As the fundamental balance of power remained unchanged, we must end the battle on the left flank as quickly as possible and then go to support our allies, Bryce decided, summoning Joyce after reviewing the overall situation. By this time, the Alda army had already conducted 4 volleys, inflicting heavy casualties on the Kent army. The enemy hadn't actually broken up, they had simply retreated, but their arrows were now much less powerful and scattered, lacking any coherent formation. Prepare for a volley. At the command, the first rank of soldiers immediately knelt on one knee, and the 3 ranks simultaneously pointed their rifles at the enemy. Fire. 3 platoons of soldiers pulled the triggers simultaneously. A deafening roar erupted, the force of which startled everyone else on the battlefield. Both sides, locked in combat, stopped abruptly and turned towards the Arda army. A scene of ferocious beasts fighting a rabbit was unfolding. The combined power of the 3 platoons' volley was immense, not only mowing down a large number of archers who were drawing their bows, but also shattering the morale of the remaining archers. "Father in heaven," one archer cried out in despair before turning and running. His comrade, who had been standing in front of him, was struck by a stray bullet, his head shattered like a watermelon, the skull crashing back onto him. This cry was the final straw. Inspired by him, the surrounding Kent soldiers also turned and ran. While they had been slowly retreating, maintaining a semblance of order, now chaos reigned. Everyone wished they had 2 legs. Bryce drew his sword and pointed forward. "Charge, kill." 3 ranks of Arda soldiers suddenly erupted in a battle cry, then charged at the fleeing Kent archers with their bayonets fixed. A few who were still firing arrows turned and ran as soon as they saw the enemy charging. The Kent archers had long lost the protection of their spearmen, and their only melee weapon was a dagger, utterly ineffective against the Arda soldiers' bayonets. Moreover, they were in a rout, and no one was there to organize a counterattack. The officers themselves were terrified and didn't know where to run. Joss, bayonet in hand, followed closely beside Sergeant Makarov. Previously, whether fighting cavalry or exchanging fire with archers, they had used muskets to engage the enemy from a distance. This time, however, they were going to fight face to face, well, actually, face to back, because the enemy was currently fleeing. Sergeant Makarov caught up with an enemy soldier and cleanly plunged his bayonet into his back. Seeing their relentless pursuit, several other enemy soldiers nearby turned and drew their daggers, their eyes flashing with ruthlessness. Whether to intimidate them or to bolster their own courage, the archers shouted in a strange, guttural voice, then charged forward, daggers in hand. Makarov gestured behind him, raising his bayonet to block the dagger at the front. Joss and another comrade faced the archers charging from behind. His comrade forcefully deflected the daggers, and taking advantage of the archer's stumble, Joss accurately plunged his bayonet into his left rib, with a precision he always demonstrated in training. No hesitation, no mercy. Who thinks of such things in a life or death situation? However, in retrospect after the battle, things might be different. The other Kent soldiers who attempted to retaliate, seeing their comrade at the forefront so easily killed, went limp, their daggers falling to the ground. "Spare us. We surrender." They knelt on the ground, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Similar scenes were playing out repeatedly on the right flank of Kent's army. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel, a textbook rout," 3rd Battalion Commander Joyce said to Bryce with satisfaction. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.